There was only enough food left in the Southgate shelter to last 4 days. A pack of twilight wolves had blocked the only road to the grain warehouses in the west, and had already devoured 2 caravans, along with their horses and people. In 4 days, the 318 people behind these walls would begin to starve to death. Guard Captain Bram told the council this that evening, and his words spread through the shelter faster than a wildfire. Aaron Colt heard them as he stood by the cauldron of thin soup made from the last of the grain. He was 19. 6 months ago, the world had fallen apart. Obelisks fell from the sky, and every person over the age of 18 was granted the right to touch the stone and awaken their class. Soldiers gained strength. Hunters gained a keen sense of smell. Archers gained an eye that the machines of the old world envied. Aaron had been waiting 6 months for his turn at the obelisk, because the shelter's leader, Crane, compiled the list of awakenings and put the handyman at the very end. On the morning of the 5th day, it was Arena's turn. He placed his palm on the cold stone, and the stone hummed. Lines flashed before his eyes. Class, awakened, cook, level 1. The crowd at the obelisk was silent for about 3 seconds. Then someone laughed. Then everyone was laughing. Bram stood to the side with his arms crossed, staring at Arena as if he were a blank space. He told the scribe to strike the boy's name from the fighter rosters and assign him to the supply train. Crane said from his platform that the system sometimes plays pranks, and that even a prank has its place by the cauldron. Aaron clenched the ladle so tightly his fingers turned white. He didn't respond. He returned to the kitchen and opened his class interface. The lines hung before his eyes, even and calm. Skill 1, Butchering, allows you to safely butcher the carcasses of mutated creatures. Skill 2, Purification, removes the distortion toxin from the flesh of mutated creatures. Aaron reread the second line 4 times. The distortion toxin was a death sentence for all of humanity. Monster meat was inedible. Anyone who tasted it died within an hour in agony. That was why people were starving in the midst of a world overflowing with meat. Wolves devoured caravans. Crabs swarmed by the river. Stag beetles trampled the fields. Tons of food roamed around the walls and killed anyone who tried to eat it. And in Aaron's interface, there was a skill that removed the toxin. He sat down on a crate and exhaled slowly. Then he went to look for Bram. The captain listened to him for exactly 10 seconds. Then he said he had 300 mouths to feed and 4 days, and no time for the nonsense of a kid with a cook's class. Aaron said he needed just 1 carcass. Hunters kill wolves on the outskirts anyway, and burn the bodies anyway. He asked for 1 body instead of a bonfire. Bram gave him a long look. Then he said that if the kid got poisoned, at least the line for soup would be shorter. That evening, a twilight wolf was dragged up to the kitchen. The beast was the size of a calf. Its black fur had a bluish sheen. Its fangs were as long as a palm. The hunters tossed the carcass by the threshold and stood watching, hoping for a show. Aaron took a knife. The butchering skill activated on its own. His hands moved as if he'd been cutting up monsters his whole life. The knife followed the hidden lines that Aaron could see right on the hide. The hide came off in 1 piece. The meat lay in even, dark layers. He removed the heart from the carcass, and it glowed from within with a dim blue light. The interface indicated that this was the heart of a first-rank beast, and that it was a highly valuable ingredient. The crowd near the kitchen fell silent. Aaron lit a fire. He activated purification. His palms glowed white, and black steam rose from the meat. The toxin seeped out of the flesh like smoke from wet firewood. After a minute, the steam dissipated, and the meat became simply meat, dark, dense, and smelling so strong that the hungry people's stomachs growled. He tossed the pieces onto a metal sheet with fat and salt. The smell wafted over the shelter. People gathered silently around the kitchen. 300 hungry people stood and watched the wolf sizzle. A new line appeared before Aaron's eyes. Dish ready. Twilight wolf roast. Effect: movement speed increased by 1/3. Duration: 2 hours.
Aaron placed the first piece on a tin plate and carried it to Bram. He said that if the captain didn't believe him, he should test it on himself, and Aaron ate a piece first, right in front of everyone. The meat was the best he'd eaten in half a year. A wave of warmth washed over his body. The world around him seemed to slow down for a split second. He picked up a stone from the ground and hurled it at a post. His arm moved twice as fast as usual. The crowd exhaled in unison.
Bram took the plate. He ate slowly, his expression unchanging. Then he stood up. He drew his sword and slashed at the training log with a series of 6 strikes. The guards had known their captain for 20 years. None of them had ever seen him move like that. Bram looked at his sword, then at the boy by the cauldron, and the old soldier's face finally changed. He said quietly that he was taking back his words. Then he turned to the hunters and bellowed that from this moment on, not a single carcass would be burned. That night, the kitchen didn't sleep. The hunters went out beyond the wall in groups and killed wolves, no longer for defense, but for prey. Aaron butchered, cleaned, and roasted the meat. The interface dripped with experience points for every dish. By dawn, he had reached level 3 and unlocked the camping cauldron skill, which allowed him to cook 50 servings at once. People ate the hot meat and wept. The children slept with full bellies for the first time in a month. The 4-day crisis was over. The pack that had been blocking the road to the warehouses had itself become a warehouse. That morning, the hunters, boosted by the speed skill, raced straight through wolf territory and returned with grain and 11 carcasses. The shelter was abuzz with talk of the cook, and at exactly noon, 4 guards from Crane's personal security detail came for Aaron. The shelter's leader received him in his office with its plush armchairs. Crane smiled. He spoke at length and eloquently about duty, about the common good, about how such a gift could not belong to a single person. Then he placed a piece of paper on the table. The document stated that the awakened Aaron Colt was hereby declared a strategic resource of the Southgate shelter, that from now on he would live in a separate wing under guard, that he would cook according to standards approved by the council, and that he was forbidden to leave the premises for the rest of his life. Crane slid the paper across the table and said that the signature was merely a formality, because the door behind Aaron was already locked. The door behind him was indeed locked. Aaron looked at the paper and weighed his options. There weren't many. He picked up a pen and signed it. Crane smiled even wider and said he was pleased with Aaron's reasonableness. Aaron replied that reasonableness was a trait he shared with the leader. He had no intention of fighting in a room with 4 men standing outside the door. He intended to wait. He was housed in a wing by the north wall, a barred window, a guard at the door. The kitchen was moved there as well, and from that day on, Aaron's life turned into an assembly line. Carcasses were brought in the morning. Prepared rations were taken out in the evening. He was specifically forbidden from preparing his own meals. Crane feared the cook might get out of hand. Rations with special properties weren't going to the people in the shelter. People were once again receiving watery soup. As for the meat with special properties, Crane loaded it into crates, and the crates were shipped east to the military enclave of Fort Garnet. From there came ammunition, fuel, and gold from the old world. Aaron remained silent, cooking and watching. The interface was dripping with experience. Level 5, Level 6. At Level 7, the system displayed a line that took his breath away. Class artifact unlocked. Field kitchen. A summoned structure bound to its owner. Deploys within 1 minute. Contains a hearth, a storage compartment, and a cutting table. It cannot be taken away and cannot be summoned without the owner's will. Aaron closed the interface and smiled for the first time in a week. Now he had a kitchen that couldn't be locked away. All that remained was to go outside the wall. Help came on its own. The hunter of the world brought carcasses in the mornings. She was 22. Class, tracker. She hunted wolves farther and more efficiently than anyone else, and she was the first to notice that the rations were running out, and that the refuge was once again eating water mixed with grains. On the 6th morning, she lingered at the table and quietly said that her younger brother Toby had fainted from hunger right against the wall yesterday. She asked with her eyes. Aaron Aaron answered aloud. He said he prepared 40 portions of fortified meat a day, and that not a single one went to the people who hunted that meat. Mira slammed a carcass down on the table so hard the boards creaked. That evening, the hunters gathered by the north wing. It wasn't a riot. Just 12 people stood in silence, staring at the bars on the cook's window. Crane brought out the guards. Bram ordered the guards to disperse, and the guards obeyed Bram rather than Crane. Everything hung by a thread and snapped not from within, but from within. An alarm blared from the river. Armored crabs were advancing on the wall, not a dozen as usual. A wave. A scout shouted from the watchtower that he'd counted over 100 and that something massive was following them. First-rank crabs were breaking through the palisade with their claws in just 3 strikes. And the massive creature was what the watchtower guards had dubbed the Valen, a second-rank armored lord the size of a truck. The Southgate wall wouldn't hold its blow for long. Crane was bellowing orders to defend the gate. Bram came to Aaron himself. He unlocked the door with a key he'd snatched from the guard captain's belt and said that the shelter didn't need a locked-up resource. It needed a cook on the wall. Aaron came out. He set up the field kitchen right on the plaza at the foot of the wall. The structure materialized from the light in a minute. The hearth hummed. He threw all the wolf meat from the storeroom onto the grates and yelled at the hunters to eat on the go. Speed up by 1/3 for 2 hours. The 12 hunters of Mira were the first to eat and then vanished onto the wall like shadows. Arrows flew twice as fast. Crabs scrambled up and fell. But Valen reached the gate, and his first blow knocked a beam out of the gate's hinges. Aaron stared at the blue wolf's heart he'd been carrying in his bag for half a year. The interface had long since suggested the recipe. A beast's broth, a first-rank heart. The effect doubles the potency of any dish eaten afterward. He boiled the heart in a cauldron in 4 minutes while the gate lost beam after beam. Bram and the 3 best fighters received the broth. Next came the roast. Not 1/3, but 2/3 faster. Bram and the trio rushed out through the gate just as the gate leaves collapsed. The people on the wall witnessed this battle and talked about it for a year afterward. 4 men swirled around the ruler like wasps. Their claws struck empty air. Swords found the joints of the armor time and time again. The giant roared and thrashed about, unable to reach anyone. 7 minutes later, he collapsed to the ground, and his roar died down. The remaining crabs, without their ruler, lost their formation, and the hunters finished off the wave by dawn. The refuge still stood. At the gate lay enough meat to last a month, and in the square, Crane and Aaron stood face to face, with a signed piece of paper lying between them. Crane began to speak about how the resource had proven itself, and that the council would revise the regulations. Aaron tore the paper in half. He said he was leaving, that his kitchen couldn't be taken away because it was part of his class, that he wouldn't abandon the people and would leave all the supplies of processed meat to Bram. But he wouldn't belong to anyone. Crane nodded to the guards, and the guards didn't budge. Bram stood next to the cook. Mira stood next to the cook. 12 hunters stood next to the cook. Crane looked at the scene and swallowed his words. In the morning, a wagon drawn by a pair of horses drove out of the south gate. Sitting in the wagon were Aaron and Mira, along with skinny 14-year-old Toby, who had refused to let his sister go. Behind them walked the hunter Garth, a burly man of the shield-bearer class, who said it was the first time in half a year he'd eaten his fill, and that he would now guard such a cook for free. Bram stayed behind to hold Southgate, and, as a farewell, told Aaron that he had performed a miracle, and that miracles in this world go unpunished. He turned out to be right sooner than he thought. The crates of rations that Crane had sold to the east had already done their job. A rumor spread along the roads about a cook from Southgate whose dishes turned people into beasts. The rumor reached Fort Garnet and landed on the major's desk. It also reached those who didn't build forts. 40 kilometers to the south, in the ruins of an old gas station, the leader of the Rusty Dogs gang, a man named Scarve, listened to the captive merchant's story. Then he was silent for a long time. Then he told his men that the armies of the world depend on supplies, and that a man who brews power in a cauldron is worth more than any armory. He ordered them to find the wagon with the kitchen. Only the cooks were to be taken alive. The wagon was heading east along the broken highway of the old world. The plan was simple: to set up at the crossroads of 4 paths near the burned-out junction where the caravan routes of the 3 sanctuaries converged. People roamed there. Monsters roamed there. The cooks cook needed both. They made their first stop by the river, and the river immediately bared its teeth. Armored crabs lived there too. Garth took the first one on his shield and held it off until Mira found a gap under the claw with her arrow. Aaron butchered the prey by the water. The interface displayed a new recipe, and Aaron read the lines aloud. Baked crab in its own shell. Effect: the skin gains the hardness of chitin. Damage from claws and fangs is reduced by half. Duration: 2 hours. Garth ate a portion and asked Mira to stab him in the forearm with a knife. Mira struck him lightly at first, then with full force. The knife left a white streak, but didn't pierce the skin. Garth roared with laughter so loudly that birds took flight from the trees. They reached the crossroads on the third day, and Aaron set up the kitchen right in the center of the intersection on a concrete island at an old gas station. From there, time passed in fits and starts. On the first day, a single caravan stopped by the kitchen. The caravanners ate in silence and with suspicion, paying with bullets. A week later, 3 tents belonging to regular customers, hunting parties of 3 who set out from here on hunts, were already pitched at the intersection. 2 weeks later, the hunters were bringing the carcasses to Aaron themselves and paying with meals. A canopy, a hitching post, and a board where today's menu was written in chalk had sprung up next to the kitchen. A month later, the crossroads was called the Hearth, and that name was known on all 4 roads. Experience flowed like a river. Level 10 unlocked the cellar skill, which preserved food without spoilage. Level 12 unlocked soul seasoning, which enhanced the flavor and extended the effects by a third. But the most important levels were the people. It wasn't just random mouths that found their way to the kitchen. The best of the best found their way to the kitchen, because a hunter who ate meat with special properties would bring back twice as much game as a hunter living on plain porridge, and the best among them figured this out faster than anyone else. And so, a trio of archer sisters from the destroyed Milford Refuge settled at the Hearth. And so remained Dorn, the spearman, who had previously worked for caravans in exchange for food, but now worked for food with special effects. And the difference was like the difference between life and death. A skeptic was found here as well, Hagen, the chief merchant of the largest caravan on the Eastern Road, a gray-haired, sinewy man who had been trading goods for 40 years and trusted nothing but the scales. He stopped at the Hearth and declared in front of everyone that the miraculous meat was a trick for fools, that the young man was mixing old-world combat chemicals into the food, and the simpletons were paying for a fairy tale. Aaron didn't argue. He placed a plate of roasted crab in front of Hagen and offered to test it with the scales the merchant trusted. Hagen ate it. Then he stepped away from the table. He took a crossbow from his bodyguard. He ordered him to shoot him in the palm from 10 paces away. The bodyguard refused, and Hagen bellowed that it was an order. The bolt struck his palm and ricocheted off, leaving a bruise. Hagen stood there, staring at his hand. 40 years of scales and invoices were etched on his face and were beginning to crumble. Then he turned to Aaron and said he had been wrong, that he would buy whatever the cook agreed to sell, and that he would sign any supply contract. From that day on, Hagen's caravans carried the Hearth's dishes in sealed pots to the 3 refuges, and its fame spread not as a rumor, but as a commodity. That fame also brought the dogs. Scarv had been planning the raid for 3 weeks and executed it skillfully. At dawn, when the hunting trios had left to hunt and only the kitchen crew remained, 40 guns and blades against 7. The rusty dogs emerged from the morning fog on 3 sides, and Scarv shouted that he wanted only the cook and that the rest could leave alive. He didn't know 2 things. The first was Mira, who a week earlier had spotted a stranger watching from the hill and told Aaron about it. The second was preparation. The 7 by the kitchen ate breakfast every morning according to a combat schedule that Aaron had laid out like a menu. Crab shell for Garth and Dorn, wolf speed for the sisters and Mira, and on that particular morning, a decoction made from the second blue heart harvested that month was simmering in the cauldron, and the effects were doubled. The hounds went after the 7 ruffians. The dogs pounced on men with skin that bullets couldn't pierce and hands that moved faster than a trigger. Garth and Dorn simply walked right through the gunfire. The sisters took out Scarva's gunmen within the first minute. Mira swept past the flank like a gust of of wind. Aaron stood by the cauldron with a butcher's cleaver, and no one made it to him. 10 minutes later, 22 dogs lay in the dust, while the rest fled down the southern road, discarding their weapons. Scarva was taken alive. He sat tied up near the kitchen, looking up at the cook. In his eyes was not fear, but a cold calculation that Aaron found far more unsettling than fear itself. Scarva said something strange. He said that the cook was wrong to think the main threat to him was people, that the dogs had been following the wagon's tracks for a month, and they weren't the only ones who'd seen those tracks, that the monsters by the roads were behaving strangely. The wolves hadn't touched their camp, but circled at night around the scent of the mess kits, that the beasts were drawn to that scent as if it were blood, and that one day something would come for the cook, something with no price and no deal. Aaron handed the prisoners over to Hagen's caravan for trial by the Three Havens, and Scarv's words stuck in the back of his mind like a splinter. And 3 days later, the splinter stirred. Toby ran in from the northern outpost and reported that he'd found, at the border of the hunting grounds, 6 wolf carcasses. Something had killed the wolves but not eaten them. All 6 had only their hearts cut out. The incision was clean, almost surgical. Mira went to examine the tracks and returned with a pale face. She said the tracks didn't match anything on her lists: 4 paws and a stride length of 3 human heights, and that the tracks led in an arc. The arc curved around the hearth. Something large had been circling the kitchen, gradually narrowing its circles. The circles were getting smaller, but the beast was in no hurry to strike, and trouble was closing in on the hearth. Hagen brought news from the north that all the old-timers in these parts already knew. The ice season was coming. Once a year, a cold front descended from the dead mountains and kept temperatures at -40 for 2 weeks. And during the last ice season, the southern shelters lost 1 in 5 of their people. You can't heat against that with firewood. You can't hold out against that with walls. And the hearth stood at an open crossroads with nowhere to go. The arena interface on the 15th level was already showing the answer. The recipe appeared in the list in gray, indicating it was unavailable, and was called Heart of Fire. A stew made from the heart of an ash-maned beast. Effect: complete resistance to cold. Duration: 1 day per serving. Ash-maned beasts lived in the scorched hills 4 days' journey to the north. Second-rank predators with manes of smoldering coals. Hagen said that the shelter's hunting parties didn't go after them because only one of the last 3 parties had returned. Aaron gathered the team around the cauldron and laid everything out honestly. Without a heart of fire, the hearth won't survive the icy season, and the hearth's patrons in the shelters will die just like last year. With a heart of fire, he'll provide warmth for everyone, but they must go to a place from which only 1 in 3 returns. Garth was the first to stand up and said that after the crab shell, he'd be struck off the list of the 3. The sisters stood up. Dorn stood up. Mira simply began gathering her quiver. Toby Aaron ordered her to stay by the kitchen with Hagen, and for the first time in his life, Toby yelled at his sister and the cook, and stayed anyway. Aaron planned the march north like a menu. He carried the field kitchen rolled up and unrolled it at every rest stop, and the team marched at double speed from dawn to dusk. The scorched hills greeted them with the smell of ash and silence. They found the Ashmen on the second day by the plumes of smoke rising from their lairs. A pack of 5 beasts. Each was the size of a bull, and each one's mane smoldered and radiated such heat that the snow around their lair formed a ring of melted snow. The plan was to take out the leader at dawn while the pack was still cold and sleepy. The plan fell apart a minute before it was set to begin. As Dorn approached, he stepped on a layer of ash beneath which a 6th beast lay sleeping, unnoticed by anyone. The hill erupted in embers. What followed was no longer a plan, but a battle. The leader proved faster than any record in the hunting books. The crab-shell armor held the claws, but couldn't withstand the heat. Garth shielded Dorn from the jet of burning mane with his shield, and the shield fused with his gauntlet. Garth roared, but remained standing. The sisters struck at its eyes. Mira struck at its tendons. Aaron did something no one, not even the pack, would have expected from a cook. He snatched a flask of icy crab extract, which he'd prepared as a seasoning, from the travel cellar and hurled it into the leader's maw. The cold inside the fiery throat acted like an explosion. The leader choked on the steam and reared up, and Mira, from 20 paces away, loosed an arrow into the jaws that had been forced open by the crab. The leader collapsed. Without him, the pack fought for another minute before retreating into the hills. 3 ash-maned carcasses remained on the snow, and Garth, alive, but with his right arm scorched to the bone from the elbow down. They walked back in silence and quickly. Garth's right hand remained in a splint, and the caravan healer said that the strong man would never be able to lift his shield again. Garth listened and replied that he would then learn to hold the shield with his left hand. No one laughed, because everyone knew he would learn. Aaron cut open the chieftain on the field table and removed a heart the size of 2 fists. The heart glowed from within with an even amber light, and the snow around the table melted. The interface opened the recipe, turning it from gray to white, and added a line that Aaron read twice. Warning: using second-rank hearts leaves a lasting trace of distortion. High-rank creatures can sense this trace. He didn't tell anyone about this line. He memorized it alongside the thorn left by Scarva's words. The ice season arrived 9 days later and became the best advertisement in the history of the hearth. The frost killed the roads and the birds in flight, and at the crossroads a hearth burned while people in nothing but jackets unloaded wagons in 40-degree below-zero weather. Heart of Fire stew was served in portions by the bowl. Hagen transported the cauldrons to shelters under guard, and his caravanners walked through the storm as if it were summer. At the height of the season, the military arrived at the hearth. 12 old-world vehicles running on precious fuel, and Major Voss from Fort Garnet. A lean man with a face of straight lines, the very same buyer of Crane's rations. Voss surveyed the intersection and said that a makeshift supply point of such value in the neutral zone was a strategic mistake. That the fort was offering the cook a contract, walls, security, and exclusivity. Aaron had already heard the word exclusivity from Crane, though in a different context. He set a bowl of stew in front of the major and said he'd answer after he'd eaten. Voss ate like a man who had been eating standard rations for 20 years. Halfway through the bowl, the lines on his face began to blur. He finished eating. He was silent for a moment. Then he took off his glove, stepped out from under the awning into the frost, and stood there for a minute in the wind, wearing only his tunic. He returned with a different expression. He said that the future of all military operations on the continent depended on such supplies, and that he now understood why intelligence had insisted on finding this crossroads, and that the offer remained valid any day. Then he added, more quietly, the real reason he'd sat down at the table in the first place. For 9 days, Fort's intelligence had been tracking a creature of unknown classification in this quadrant. It's larger than anything on record. It had wiped out 2 surveillance teams, and in both cases, the creature hadn't touched the team's weapons or supplies. The hearts of all the monsters killed in the grid square had been cut out. And the day before yesterday, the creature stopped killing and lay down. It lies on a ridge 6 kilometers from the crossroads, with its head toward the hearth. Voss said that by all the laws of predator behavior, this wasn't a territorial hunt. It was an ambush for a specific prey. He asked the cook if he understood who was being ambushed here. Aaron looked across the frozen crossroads toward the northern ridge. No one needed an answer. The creature didn't arrive 6 kilometers away. It arrived 3 nights later. It came when the storm of the ice season struck for the last time and howled so loudly that the lookouts couldn't hear their own whistles. It wasn't a guard who sensed it first. It was the cauldron. Aaron woke up because the field kitchen was humming. The artifact vibrated like a string, and a line he'd never seen before lit up on the interface. Attention, a source of high-order distortion within range. He dashed out into the storm and bellowed, "Alert!" His cry drowned out by the wind, and then he struck the signal rail. The crew poured out of their tents into the snow. And the snow at the northern edge of the intersection stood up. What they had taken for a snowdrift 2 carts long, swept up by the storm, rose onto 4 paws and shook the white snow off itself. Mira later said that her brain refused to process it as a single body. The cat's torso was the size of a house. Its fur was gray and scarred like melted stone. Its wolf-like jaws opened wider than any jaws should. Along its spine, the embers of its ash-maned mane glowed with heat. Its front paws were armored with crab-shell chitin. The creature absorbed into itself those it had devoured. It was the same as Aaron, only the opposite. It gazed across the intersection directly at the cook, and in its yellow eyes, intelligence shone. Voss had managed to leave a detachment of 8 soldiers with rapid-fire rifles at the hearth, and the sergeant fired the first volley. The bullets struck sparks from the chitin of its paws and lodged in its hide as if in wet clay. The creature didn't even turn its head. It moved forward, and with a single swipe of its paw, it swept away the awning, the hitching post, and 2 soldiers along with their cover. From there, Aaron thought faster than he ever had before. His team's weapons were the menu. To counter the heat of the chitin and the speed of this single creature, they needed the entire menu at once. He shouted at Mira to keep the creature's eyes pinned with arrows. He shouted at Garth and Dorn not to take the blow head-on, but to hurt it between the car wrecks. As for himself, he dove into the kitchen, right into the thick of the fire, because there was nowhere else to cook under attack, and no one else to do it. The humming artifact obeyed him as if it were an extension of his own hands. A brew from the beast's last blue heart to double the potency. Wolf tenderloin for speed. All that was left of the crab stock. And the heart of fire, not for the stew, whole into the cauldron to be boiled down to its essence, because the interface was flickering with a new line. An experimental recipe, the essence of 2 principles, fire and ice, in a single target's body. The effect is unpredictable. Outside, the team was paying for every minute of his time. Dorn managed to drag the creature away from the kitchen, and a paw grazed him, sending the spearman flying into a snowdrift with broken ribs. The sisters struck at its eyes, and the creature learned to shield its eyes with its chitinous crest after 3 of their volleys. Garth held his shield with his left hand, and the shield was already bent in half. Mira was the fastest of them all, and that was why she was still alive. The creature cornered her against the tank's frame and opened its jaws wider than its shoulders, and then a cauldron flew into its gaping maw. The essence of the 2 elements raged within the creature like a war. Fire burst outward from the ice, and ice burst outward from the fire. The creature screamed. It didn't roar. It screamed with a voice that made everyone standing there freeze in their tracks. Its spine arched. The embers along its spine turned black, and the chitin on its paws began to crack. Aaron bellowed that it was now or never. The fighters struck the cracks simultaneously at double speed. The sisters' swords, the spear that Dorn hurled with one hand while lying in a snowdrift. Mira's arrow pierced the creature's closed eye through a slit in its crest. The creature shook its head and flung the people off like water, and Aaron realized that even that wasn't enough. The beast stood there, wounded and smoking, with no intention of dying. It looked at the cook with a long, yellow gaze. Then it turned, and in 3 leaps, vanished into the storm to the north. The snow covered its tracks within a minute. The silence that followed rang louder than the battle. The crossroads lay half destroyed. Dorn was wheezing, but he was breathing. Of Voss's 8 soldiers, 5 were still on their feet. The kitchen had survived because the creature had spared spared it until the very end, just as one would spare a plate from which one is about to eat. Aaron stood amid the rubble, reading the lines that the interface had displayed before him, filling his entire field of vision. Attention. You have been marked by a predator of the highest order. The creature, the Heart Eater, has remembered the taste of your corruption. The creature will return. Every heart it devours increases its power. And below, the second line, from which a chill crept up his spine, no longer caused by the storm. A section of high-order recipes has been detected. Ingredients. The flesh of creatures bearing the mark of the hunt for you. The system closed the circle with mocking honesty. The world's finest recipes lay within those who would come to kill it. In the morning, the storm subsided, and a sentry ran in from the northern outpost. He reported that at dawn, he had seen a ridge 6 kilometers away. The Heart Eater was heading north along that ridge, and trailing behind him in a long chain were wolves, ash-maned beasts, and creatures whose names the sentry did not know. They did not walk like prey. They walked like a pack following their leader. Aaron gathered everyone at the shattered shelter. The crew, Hagen, the sergeant. He said that the creature would return stronger and bring an army, and that waiting for it behind walls that no longer existed was a slow death. He said there was a second way. The Devourer was now the continent's most valuable ingredient, and a gray line bearing its name was already glowing on Aaron's recipe list. He said he was proposing something no one in this world had ever done before: to open a real restaurant on the ruins of the hearth, with walls, cellars, and a dining hall, and to embark on the first hunt in history where hunters would drive the beast into a trap for the sake of the menu. Garth asked, tapping his shield with his left hand. When are we leaving? They couldn't leave right away, and Aren knew that better than anyone. A wounded beast leading a pack on its own territory would kill them within an hour. A counter hunt required a base, weapons, and levels, so he announced to the team that they would catch up to the beast through preparation. Construction of the restaurant began on the 4th day after the battle, and life unfolded in flashes like a montage. At first, there were only stakes at the crossroads, and Hagen traced them with his finger while shaking his head over the estimate. Then convoys carrying stone and lumber arrived from the 3 shelters, because Hagen had sent out letters explaining that the outpost that fed everyone during the icy season had to be enclosed within walls, and the shelters responded not out of generosity, but out of self-interest. Then, for a month, the sound of axes hung over the crossroads, and Hart hauled logs with his left hand that would have taken 2 right-handed men. And then, one morning, a caravan driver from the southern road emerged from the fog and froze in his tracks. In place of the demolished shed stood a building, a stone first floor with walls a meter thick, a hall with 60 seats, cellars extending 2 levels into the ground, a watchtower and a palisade with a moat encircling it. Above the door hung a sign forged by the caravan's blacksmith, The Hearth, a restaurant and hunter's guild. Voss coined the word guild, and he did so for a reason. The major arrived at the opening with paperwork and proposed a plan that made Hagen grunt in approval. Fort Garnett recognizes the Hearth as neutral supply territory. The shelters receive quotas for meals, and hunters from across the land gain the right to deliver carcasses to the Hearth and take hunting orders, just like in the old legends about guilds. The restaurant became a marketplace where meat was the currency. Aren signed the agreement, and from that day on, experience poured in at a rate he could never have imagined. The kitchen operated from dawn until nightfall, level 20, level 22. At level 25, the system granted what everything had been building up to, the skill Feast of Heroes. It allows one to prepare Mass Effect dishes for 100 people with a single effect. And the second skill right after that, Taste Memory. It allows one to identify, based on a sample of flesh, a complete list of a creature's attributes and the weaknesses of its body. Aaron brought a fragment of chitin from the Devourer's paw, which he'd picked up after the battle, out of the cellar, placed it on the cutting table, and activated the skill. The interface took a full minute to load. Heart Devourer, a 4th-rank chimera, absorbs the properties of the hearts it eats without limitation. Current composition, 9 types. Weakness 1. The hearts within its body do not merge but exist separately and conflict with one another. The conflict of properties within the body causes tissue destruction. Weakness number 2. The chimera's original heart cannot withstand the strain and requires replacement every cycle. The creature does not hunt for food. The creature seeks a heart strong enough to become permanent. Aaron read on, a chill running down his spine. The essence of the two principles had struck the creature so devastatingly precisely through its first weakness. And the second weakness fully explained the ambush at the crossroads. The devourer didn't need a cook as food. The devourer needed a person whose corruption immediately reeked of all the hearts that had passed through his hands. The creature was looking for a heart for itself, and chose him. Mira caught him in the midst of these thoughts, and understood everything from the look on his face before he even spoke. She said that since the creature lived by a cycle, the hunt had a time limit. Aaron nodded. His taste memory also revealed the cycle. The devourer had about 40 days left before needing a new heart. After that, he would either find a replacement or begin to die, and in either case, he would cease to be a viable prey. He would either become invincible or die in his lair and rot away along with the recipe of the highest order. 40 days to prepare for the counter-hunt. The guild had provided more than just experience. The guild had provided people, and among them was a skeptic of a kind Aaron had never encountered before. On the 20th day, a man in a cloak made of northern serpent hide entered the hearth hall, and the hunters at the tables fell silent. His name was Caden Wolf, a loner with the Beast Slayer class, a living legend of the region, a man who single-handedly sealed the breach at Milford, and who, as a matter of principle, ate nothing but his own prey. He sat down at the bar and told Aaron to his face, in an even voice, that he had no interest in the kitchen, that strength from a plate is just a crutch, that hunters who've grown fat on others' efforts will forget how to hunt, and when that crutch is taken away, they'll all fall at once. He'd come because he'd heard about the chimera hunt, and wanted to claim that trophy himself, without cooks and without guilds. Aaron didn't argue, and that stung Caden more than any argument would have. The cook simply laid a fragment of chitin on the counter and rattled off a list of the 9 species that made up the creature, along with both of its weaknesses and the cycle of its heart's regeneration. Caden listened, his fingers slowly clenching the edge of the counter. He'd hunted the devourer for 3 months even before the hearth. He'd lost a partner on that hunt. He knew less about the creature than the cook had learned from a piece of carapace in a minute. He asked where the information came from. Aaron replied that the kitchen wasn't just a crutch, but a source of intelligence and an arsenal, and offered a deal. Caden could go on the hunt as a free agent without any meals if he wanted, but the route and plan would be based on the kitchen's data. Caden was silent for a long time. Then he said he'd follow the plan but wouldn't eat anyway, and it sounded less like a verdict and more like a bargaining chip. 40 days were cut short to 30 when news arrived from the north that changed the entire schedule. A young messenger from the northern camp of the Coal Eaters came running, and he was shaking, not from the run. The devourer, with its pack, had approached the camp the night before last. The people were sitting in their cellars, and the beast did not touch them. It lay down in the square and remained there until dawn, then left, and the pack of monsters that followed it devoured every last bit of the settlement's supplies. Mira asked why the chimera had lain in the middle of a human settlement all night. Caden answered, because he was the first to understand, and for the first time, his voice wavered. The creature had left a mark. It marked the camp just as a herder marks the corner of a pen. It wasn't gathering the pack to head north. It was setting a trap, a wide arc spanning all the settlements in the region, and that arc curved toward the crossroads where 4 roads met. The devourer was preparing the same counter-hunt against the hearth that the hearth had been preparing against it, and his timeline wasn't 40 days. The War Council convened in the restaurant's banquet hall that very night, and a map of the region was laid out on the pushed-together tables. Caden placed markers based on the messenger's reports, and the arc became clear. The devourer had passed the charcoal burners' camp, the fishing village on the river bend, and the abandoned farm near the old mill. 3 markers. The encirclement was closing in from the north and east, and based on the width of the arc, Caden estimated the pack at 200, not counting the leader. Voss confirmed the worst along his line. Fort Reconnaissance had recorded monsters converging from all over the border toward the northern hills. The creatures weren't driven by hunger. They were led by the scent of a 4th-rank leader, and neither ditches nor palisades, designed to handle scattered waves, would work against against such an organized force. Aaron looked at the map and saw the situation in reverse. 200 monsters meant 200 carcasses, and somewhere among them roamed the continent's main ingredient. The only question was who would dispatch whom first. He proposed the plan himself, and Sergeant Voss's face fell at the suggestion. "We can't wait for a raid outside the walls because the walls aren't meant for fourth rank. We can't catch up to the pack in the hills because that's its territory." So they had to force the devourer to abandon the pack and come alone to where the cook had prepared the field. The hearth had exactly one bait, and that bait was now standing by the map and was named Aaron Colt. The beast was seeking his heart. The beast could sense his corruption from kilometers away. If the cook and a small group were to leave the protection of the walls and walk out in the open, the leader won't hand that heart over to the pack. He'll come to take it himself. Mira said that was madness. Caden said it was the first sensible plan he'd heard from a man with a cooking spoon, and that on one of his old hunts, he'd lost a partner precisely because they'd chased the creature instead of making the creature chase them. They spent a full day choosing a spot for the trap, and in the end, Hagen, who'd led caravans for 40 years and knew the region like the back of his hand. A salt mine a day's journey to the northwest. A vast open-pit quarry from a bygone era. Bare white terraces without a single hiding spot for the pack, and with just one wide entrance. The salt cut through the scents and dulled the beast's senses, and in the quarry, the creature couldn't have led 200 heads in unnoticed, and more importantly, wouldn't have. Why would the pack go there when the prey had come into the pit on its own? Preparations were once again rushed through with a setup, and this time the setup was military style. On the first day, Hagen's caravans, under the guise of salt mining, delivered timber and chains to the quarry, and Voss deployed 2 squads equipped with rapid-fire weapons and a harpoon gun from an old-world whaling barge that had been removed from Fort's River warehouse. On the third day, Aaron set up a second position on the lower terrace because reaching level 20 unlocked an artifact upgrade, and the field kitchen could now be set up in 2 locations at once. On the 5th day, the guild's entire combat unit, the 40 best hunters, practiced formation drills in the quarry at the sound of a whistle, and Caden drove them hard until dark, noting that half of them had gotten out of shape from the perks, just as he'd predicted. These days, the kitchen was operating like an arsenal before a war. Aaron was distilling essences using a new set of recipes, and his taste memory suggested combinations that would keep even him awake for only 3 hours at a time. The trump card was brewing in a separate, locked cauldron. The creature remembered the essence of the 2 elements, and it wouldn't fall for the same trick twice. That's why Aaron was preparing a 3rd element. They brought up from the cellar everything that remained from the butchering of Valoon, the armored ruler, whom Hagen had bought from Southgate based on his letter a month ago. A 2nd-rank heart of the water element. Water against fire, ice, and stone, all within a single body where 9 hearts were already at each other's throats. Not a weapon, but a storm in a bottle. On the 8th day, trouble came from a direction they hadn't expected. A harried messenger from Brem galloped in from Southgate. The roundup was more extensive than the map showed. The western wing of the pack had reached the Wolflands near the grain warehouses, and Southgate was once again surrounded, only now the pack obeyed their leader and didn't scale the walls, but simply waited. Bram wrote that this time there would be enough food to last a long time, but people had seen a cauldron the size of a house on the ridge. A cauldron the size of a house, and that if the cook knew what it was, he should say honestly how much time the refuge had left. Aaron knew it was none at all. As soon as the devourer replaced its heart, the hunt would devour the border piece by piece, and Southgate would be first. He sent a brief reply, "Hold out for 9 days." Then he added a line that Mira said was typical of him. "Get the big cauldrons ready." On the 10th day, everything was ready, and it became clear that they couldn't delay any longer because the creature's tracks had already been found 3 hours away from the crossroads. On the morning of the 11th day, a small group emerged from the gates of Ochag and set off toward the northwest, openly and noisily. Aaron led the way with a camping cauldron on his back, from which smoke was deliberately billowing, carrying all the smells of the kitchen at once. Mira and Caden flanked him. Garth and Dorn brought up the rear. The sisters had gone into the quarry the day before, following Voss's calculations. They'd been walking for a day, and since noon, Aaron had felt a gaze on the back of his neck. His taste memory trembled on the edge of action, hinting at the presence of a higher order distortion at the outer limit of the radius. The creature was moving moving parallel to them, alone. The calculations held true. By sunset, the group had descended to the white terraces of the quarry and taken up position at the lowest point near the second kitchen, and Aaron set the cauldron over the fire as one would bait a hook. He cooked in the open. He boiled away the remnants of the heart of the fire in the cauldron, and the scent of a second-rank distortion drifted over the salt like a scream. Darkness fell. The salt glowed beneath the two moons, the old and the new. The harpoon sets lay under a tarp, with salt piled on top to mask the scent. 40 hunters sat in the niches of the upper terrace, quieter than the stones. Mira lay on the middle tier with her bow and the finest arrow from the borderlands. And at the third hour of the night, a shadow descended onto the white entrance terrace. The devourer walked into the quarry slowly and low, and since their last encounter, it had grown stronger. Along the ridge between the coals, the bone plates of the northern serpent now glinted, and Caden, standing next to Aaron, breathed out the name of his old enemy, for he recognized whose hide the beast had devoured over the past month. The chimera stopped on the upper terrace. It raised its head, and fixed its yellow gaze precisely where the first harpoon crew lay beneath the tarpaulin and salt. A second hung in the air like a drop from a knife. The creatures stared at the tarpaulin and salt, and the crew beneath them held their breath. Then Aaron did the only thing that could override a higher order sense. He tipped the entire flask of fire essence into the cauldron. A column of steam, carrying the scent of a second-rank heart, shot into the sky above the lower terrace, and to the chimera's nose, it was like a flash of light to the eyes. Its yellow gaze tore away from the tarpaulin and fell on the cook, and the devourer leaped. It crossed 3 terraces in 2 bounds, and Aaron had just enough time to think that in a month, the creature had become a third faster. From then on, it wasn't he who thought, but the plan. Caden's whistle. The first harpoon struck from below, to the side, beneath the front paw, where taste memory had indicated a weak spot in the chitin. The tip penetrated, the chain clanged, and the second cannon struck the creature from the other side at the base of its tail. The devourer roared and lunged, and the beams dug into the salt creaked, but held. 40 hunters rose from their niches and struck according to the drill they'd practiced for 10 days. Not as a crowd, in threes. Each trio, using dual-effect weapons, had its own task. The sisters knocked out the bony plates of the spine. Dorn's trios bound the hind legs with chains and hooks. Hart, with his new shield on his left, took his position where the chains might not hold. Mira, from her vantage point, drove arrows into the old wound in its eye again and again, preventing the crest from closing properly. The beast fought like 9 beasts at once, because that's exactly what it was. Heat radiated from its mouth like that of a fire-breathing beast. Its paws struck with wolf-like speed. Its tail, with its serpentine scales, sliced through the beam like grass. In the first 3 minutes, it ripped out 1 harpoon, along with the meat attached to it, reduced a second cannon to scrap, and swept 3 hunters off the terrace. They survived only because their crab-shell armor held the blows at a glancing angle. But the chains on its hind legs came together, and Caden waited for his moment. The beast slayer was so engrossed in the fight that Aaron forgot about the cauldron for a second. Caden slipped beneath the blow of the paw, right up against the chimera's chest, and with 2 short blades, slid open the joint between the plates where the essence had left a crack a month ago. The old wound hadn't fully healed. Caden jammed a charge of miner's gunpowder from Hagen's supplies into the crack, rolled back, and the chest plate was torn off by the explosion. Beneath the plate beat the very thing for which the whole operation had been undertaken. Not a single heart, a cluster. 9 hearts of different colors, their veins fused together around the 10th. A small one, dark, wrinkled like an old fruit. The chimera's own heart, which was nearing the end of its cycle. Aaron was already running from the lower terrace, and in his hands he held not a knife, but a clay jug containing the third principle, the entire essence of Valen's water heart. He didn't make it 4 steps. The devourer understood. He didn't sense it. He understood with the intellect that had been present in those yellow eyes since their first encounter. The creature stopped struggling against its chains and did the opposite. It lunged into the circle of the trap, straight at the cook, taking the harpoon deeper into its body for the sake of a single blow with its paw. Aaron saw the entire blow and realized he he wouldn't have time to get out of the way. Garth did. The shield-bearer flew between the paw and the cook and took the fourth-rank blow to his left arm with his shield bent. The sound was like a gunshot. Garth was sent flying 10 paces along with his shield, which was crushed flat. But the paw lost its aim and passed over Aaron's head, snipping off a lock of hair, and the jug remained intact. Aaron dove under the creature's chest, right into the thick of it between its front paws, a spot no one in their right mind would strike, and he smashed the jug directly against the exposed cluster of hearts. Water entered the conflict of the 9 elements with a 10th voice. No healer could describe what happened inside the chimera. Fire boiled the water. The water extinguished the embers. The ice tore through the steam. The stone cracked from the combined force. The cluster of hearts glowed with every color it possessed, and the colors clashed. The devourer screamed in the same voice as a month ago, only now the scream came from within, accompanied by a gurgling sound. The creature reared up to its full height, straining all its chains at once, and 2 beams flew out of the salt like rotten teeth. And then Mira struck from the gallery. She had been waiting for this moment all night. Its chest was split open. The cluster was ablaze. An arrow from the region's finest archer, with a tip of polished silver, pierced the small, dark heart at the center of the cluster right up to the fletching. The heart-eater did not die immediately. He sank onto his front paws as slowly as a house settling into the ground. His yellow eyes found Aaron and held him until the very end, and there was no hatred in them. There was something in them akin to the acknowledgement of one gatherer by another. Then the light in his eyes faded, and his carcass lay on the white salt, and it grew very quiet. The silence was broken by Dorn, who shouted from the terrace that Garth was alive. The shield-bearer lay against the quarry wall. His left arm was broken in 2 places, but he was lying there cursing, which meant he was alive. Caden stood over the body and looked at the bone plates of the northern serpent on its spine. He removed one plate, tucked it into his bosom, and said quietly that now his partner could rest. Then he turned to Aaron and spoke words that all 40 hunters heard. He was wrong. The kitchen is not a crutch. The kitchen is what allowed 40 people to do a job that would previously have required an army. And if the chef accepts him, the loner Caden Wolf requests a place in the Hearth Guild. Butchering the devourer took the rest of the night and the entire day, and was the most difficult task of Aaron's life. His skill guided his hands across the body, in which 9 elements layered. The interface spewed out lines of text non-stop. High-tier ingredient obtained. A cluster of 9 hearts. High-tier ingredient obtained. Chimera meat. 12,000 experience points obtained. Level 28. Level 30. Attention. Profession threshold reached. Development path unlocked. Master of distortion. Cooking permanent effect dishes from highest order ingredients. Aaron sat right down on the salt and reread the last line 3 times. Permanent effect, not for 2 hours, forever. Effects that remain within a person as a class. Nearby, they were loading a carcass onto a sled, laughing and bandaging Garth, and no one yet understood what was actually lying in that sled. And then a sentry shouted from the entrance terrace, and the laughter stopped. On the ridge of the quarry, bathed in the light of dawn, stood monsters. Wolves, horned beasts, and ash-maned creatures all mixed together. The pack had come for their leader, drawn by the mark, and now that the mark was dead, 200 beasts were left without the will that had held them together. They didn't attack. They stood and looked down at the carcass, and something like a tremor ran through their ranks. Caden said that the outcome would be decided now. Either the pack would scatter along the edge into 200 isolated misfortunes, or someone among them would claim the mark for themselves. And in the rear ranks on the ridge, a head larger than the others rose up. The head in the rear ranks rose higher, and the pack parted before it like a wave. A third rank, overgrown horned beast stepped out onto the ridge, a bull as tall as 2 bulls, with horns as wide as a wagon, and judging by the way the wolves cowered before him, it was clear that he had already staked his claim to the mark with blood that night. The horned bull looked down at the leader's carcass and bellowed, and in that bellow was a declaration of dominance. The pack swayed toward him, and then Aaron did something that had Caden shaking his head for a week afterward. The cook ordered the hearth in the second kitchen to be stoked, and tossed the first layer of chimera meat onto the grate. The scent of a distorted distortion of the highest order crept up the terraces to where 200 noses were deciding whom to follow. The logic was both that of a cook and that of a beast. It is not the body but power that holds the mark. And the scent of power here did not come from the horned one. The pack wavered. The horned one bellowed and called, but the noses were drawn downward toward the terraces where the fire burned, and the scent lingered of those who had killed their leader and were now calmly eating him. For a beast, this scent speaks louder than words. The stag realized he was losing the battle of wills and decided to seize power by force. He went down to the kitchen alone because the leader wasn't calling for help. The fight was short and terrifying, watched by 200 beasts and 40 people. The stag was met with a well-rehearsed attack, a harpoon to the shoulder, chains on his legs, and trios flanking him. Caden, striking at the nape with 2 blades, found a gap at the base of the skull, and a third-rank fighter lay down right by the kitchen, breaking through the final meters on the horns with 2 logs. And when he lay down, the pack upstairs lay down too. They didn't run. They lay face down, just as they do before one whose mark is stronger. The arena interface displayed a line that didn't exist in any class. Attention, a top-order territorial mark has been transferred to you. Lower-rank creatures within the radius of influence recognize your dominance and will not attack those carrying your scent. When this was relayed to Hagen, he sat down next to the bench. The cook had become the leader of the largest pack in the region. He wouldn't have to command the beasts. Simply be the one they do not hunt and whose lands they give a wide berth. Caravan routes through the territory of the mark became safe, and Hagen was already calculating in his mind that this was worth more than all the dishes put together. The pack could not be held back. Without the pressure of a leader, within 3 days it had dispersed across the region into the usual sparse wildlife, and the roads breathed a sigh of relief, and the sled carrying the carcass rolled through the gates of Ochag, amid the roar of a celebration the crossroads had never seen before. From there, Arena had 9 days left of the deadline given to Bram, and he planned them as 2 jobs at once. The first job was called Southgate. The western wing of the pack near the refuge's walls, following the leader's death, remained the largest remnant of the roundup under the rule of the local second-rank Wolf King, and it had no intention of leaving such a bountiful place. A convoy set out for that location, which Voss called the first gastronomic army in history. Caden and Mira, along with 3-man hunting teams, field cauldrons, and the main cargo. A feast for 100 heroes, made from the meat of lower-tier chimeras. Aren chose a simple effect for the walls of Southgate, a day's worth of crab-shell armor and wolf-like speed for all defenders at once. The second task remained in the hearth cellar, and was called the Cluster. The path of the Distortion Chief opened the section on permanent dishes, and the interface displayed the first recipe from the Cluster of 9 Hearts as follows. The Feast of 9 began. 9 servings. Each permanently fuses 1 property from the chimera's composition into the eater. A serving may be consumed only once in a lifetime. Warning: a body of average strength will not withstand the fusion. Requirements for the eater: body rank no lower than 2nd, or physical preparation through a course of fortifying dishes. Aaron looked at the recipe and realized that what he held in his hands was not a dinner, but the forging of a new order of people, and that such a thing could only be given to those for whom not just the leader, but everything they had lived through together, stood as a guarantee. He compiled the list himself, and had not yet shown it to anyone. The supply train reached Southgate in 2 days, and Aaron later heard the account of the battle at the walls from Mira and Brem, Turn, and their accounts matched. The defenders ate on the walls at sunset. At midnight, the Wolf King led his wing in an assault, as he had grown accustomed to doing during the month-long siege, and the assault crashed against men whom the Fangs could not take down, and who moved faster than the pack. And at dawn, the gates opened, and Caden, accompanied by his trio, went out to meet the king and struck him down from 20 paces with a blade thrown into his eye, because Arena's taste memory had already mapped out his weaknesses back in the hearth, using the messenger's fur as a template. Without their king, the wing fell apart within a day. Southgate stood firm. And that evening in the refuge's square, a scene unfolded for which Mira, in her own words, would have agreed to go through the entire campaign a second time. Crane stepped up to the field cauldrons with a speech about how the refuge had always believed in its cook. The crowd listened in silence. And then, in front of everyone, Bram asked the leader if the refuge had truly believed in its cook when it locked him up and sold his rations to the east while children were falling from the walls from hunger. The crowd was so silent that you could hear the cauldrons. A week later, the Southgate Council re-elected a leader, Bram, while Crane left for the east with a single wagon, and Aaron tried to stop himself from rejoicing out loud, but couldn't help it. Meanwhile, the hearth was growing so rapidly that the construction of new sections couldn't keep up. The entire Milford hunting party swore allegiance to the guild. Voss secured the hearth status as a separate allied settlement at the fort. The first family homes sprang up near the walls, and something appeared at the crossroads that had never been seen anywhere else in the New World. There was a line of people eager to live near the restaurant. On the 9th day, Aaron gathered 8 people in a private room: Miru, Caden, Garth, with his hand in a splint, Dorn, the 3 sisters, and Bram, who had arrived to take the guild oath. He placed 9 deep bowls on the table and told them everything about the Feast of the 9 Beginnings as it was, including the risk of fusion. He declared the 9th bowl his own, because one can only lead people to higher ranks by undergoing the forging process first. The argument was long and heated. Bram stepped aside in favor of the younger ones, and Aaron took his bowl, saying it would wait for its master, and put it away in the cellar. The doctor had forbidden Garth from any physical exertion. Garth protested loudly, but was left to undergo physical rehabilitation until his body had fully healed. The rest agreed, and chose their elements according to their own abilities. Meyer received the speed of a wolf forever. Caden received the intuition of a snake. The sisters received eyes, heat, and stone. Dorn received the hardness of a crab. Aaron's interface highlighted a separate line for his portion. The bearer of the territorial mark has access to the fusion of the leader's authority property. Permanent amplification of all territorial effects. The night after the feast, the hall did not sleep. People lay in the heat, their bodies wrestling with the new beginnings, and Aaron sat between the couches laden with broths, keeping that struggle in check just as one tends the fire beneath a cauldron. By dawn, the fever had subsided for everyone. 8 people rose from their couches as different people, and outside the gates, a messenger in the colors of Fort Garnet was already waiting with a package addressed to the head of the Hearth Guild, and the messenger's face was ashen. Voss's message was birth. Long-range reconnaissance reported that the death of a 4th-rank chimera had not gone unnoticed. From the dead mountains in the north of the realm, a creature is descending, one that the Devourer had listed in its records as its own offspring. Rank unknown, size unknown. One thing is certain, it is following the trail of the cluster of hearts. They finished reading Voss's package in complete silence, and the first to break it was Caden, with a question anyone would have asked. If this is a parent, then why didn't it go after its offspring sooner? The answer came through taste memory when Aaron went down to the cellar and placed his palm on the chest containing the cluster. After integration, the skill worked more deeply, and from a residual distortion, he read something that made him sit down on the steps. The cluster of 9 hearts was not the Devourer's prey in the usual sense. The hearts were a gift. A parent of the 4th rank or higher cannot leave the lair during the hibernation cycle and raises its young as gatherers. The young one walks the edge, gathering hearts and bringing them to the mountain, while the parent eats the best ones and continues to sleep. The Devourer wasn't looking for a replacement heart for himself. He was gathering tribute for the parent's awakening and had set his sights on the cook's heart as the main offering. But now the tribute is gone, the gatherer is dead, and the parent has awakened hungry in a year when no one came to the mountain. They discussed the strategy for a full day, and all paths led back to a single word: information. No one in the region knew anything about the creature from the dead mountains, except for the fear held by the elders, for whom the mountains had always been considered a forbidden part of the world. They could not go blindly into the unknown. They could not wait by the walls, because everyone had learned the Devourer's lesson. So we needed a reconnaissance mission to a depth no caravan had ever ventured. And then Hagen stood up and said he had been there. 40 years ago, as a boy accompanying his father, a caravan caravan leader, he'd gone all the way to the very foot of the mountain along the old salt trail, which has now been swallowed up by the wasteland. Back then, there was a settlement of Grimholt miners at the foot of the mountain, and if even a trace of it remains, the people there know more about the mountain than anyone else alive. They assembled a small, swift expedition. Aaron, because without taste memory, reconnaissance is blind. Caden and Mira, serving as eyes and legs with the elements fused within them. Hagen was their only map of the route, and a dozen hunters with 2 field cauldrons. They left the guild in the care of Dorn and the sisters, and Voss promised that by the time they returned, he'd pull everything Fort could spare from other fronts to the hearth. The route north wound through the wasteland in zigzags. On the second day, the column crossed the territorial boundary, and for the first time in a month, Aaron felt like prey, because beyond that point, his scent meant nothing. On the 4th day, Mira removed the lookout from the ridge. The creature resembled a crow the size of a dog, and its eye was covered with a white film. His taste memory told him the bird had been dead for 9 days, and that someone was watching through the dead birds. On the 6th day, they found tracks on the white taker, 4 paws and a stride 5 human heights long. After measuring the stride, Caden calmly said that the parent was at least twice as large as the young one, and that the tracks were leading not away from the mountain, but toward it. The creature was returning to its lair, with something. The answer came on the 7th day in Grimholt. The settlement at the foot of the mountain stood intact, and that was more terrifying than ruins. The houses were intact. The shutters were closed. There were neither bones nor blood in the streets. And in the square by the old mine shaft, people were sitting. 3 dozen people sat in rows on their knees, facing the mountain, and did not turn at the creak of the carts. Mira approached first and recoiled. The people were alive. Their eyes were covered with the same white film as the ravens, and all 30 of them breathed in unison, as if they were a single organ. Arena's taste memory screamed out a line that he couldn't finish reading on the first try. 5th rank distortion detected. Type of influence, shepherd. The creature subjugates living hosts through an implanted heart particle, sees through their eyes, and speaks through their mouths. And no sooner had the line faded than 30 mouths in the square opened at once and spoke with a single voice. The voice was even and devoid of malice, and for that reason, it was worse than any roar. It said that it sensed the scent of its son and the scent of his hearts on those who had come. It said that it held no grudge because the weak are always devoured by the strong, and the son had proven weak. But a tribute is a tribute. The mountain had awaited 9 hearts, and it would receive 9 hearts. He gave them 1 moon to comply. In 1 moon's time, the one who came bearing the scent of the cluster would bring it to the foot of the mountain himself and add a 10th heart, the very one his son had chosen as the chief offering. Then the mountain would accept the tribute and continue to sleep, and the land would go on living as it had before. The voice fell silent, and 30 heads turned toward Aaron in unison, like weather vanes, their white eyes fixed solely on him. Then the voice added one final thing. If the tribute is not paid, the mountain will come down on its own and take not 9 hearts, but every heart in the land, down to the very last chick. And as proof that these were not empty words, the shepherd showed them the way back. 30 hands rose at once and pointed south, and there, above the wasteland at the end of the path, a column of smoke hung in the air. Hagen stared at the smoke, and his face aged before his very eyes because he understood the direction before anyone else did. The junction of the old trade route was burning, his caravan's way station, where 6 families of his people had spent the winter. His father had passed through it on his way to the mountain, and Aaron now knew what he was bringing back to the lair. He was returning with hearts. He had collected the tribute himself and was showing what would become of the land from now on. They rode back without sleep, changing horses by the campfires, and at the trading post's ruins, they found what confirmed the worst, and one thing that offered hope. The worst was the sight of 6 burned-out houses. Their inhabitants, like the wolves in the old clearing, had only their hearts cut out. The hope was a survivor, a young cart driver who, on the night of the attack, had been sleeping in the salt cellar, where the smell of salt had once again again deceived the creature's senses. He had seen the creature through a crack in the hatch and recounted what he saw, his teeth chattering. "It's like a walking mountain. 6 paws. No eyes at all. Instead of a snout, an open bud made of bone plates, and hearts glow inside the bud. Many hearts. They hang there like fruit, glowing, and it looks through them." Aaron listened, and inside him, cold fury coalesced into a decision. They were given 1 moon not to collect tribute. They were given 1 moon to prepare for war, because the taste memory had read the line about the shepherd to the end, and at the end stood what changed everything. A fragment of an implanted heart maintains a two-way connection. The bearer is visible to the shepherd, but the shepherd is also visible to those who can read the flesh. Grimholt's 30 white eyes were not only his windows onto the realm, they were the realm's windows into him. The journey home took 4 days, and for all 4 days, Aaron planned the war in his mind, just as one plans a menu for 300 people. The column entered the gates of the hearth at dawn, and the cook didn't let anyone sleep. A council was convened by noon, and seated at the pushed-together tables were all those who mattered in the realm: Caden, Mira, Dorn, and the sisters. Hagen, his face black with grief. Bram, who had arrived from Southgate on the first carrier pigeon. Voss with 2 officers from Fort Headquarters. Aaron laid everything out: the shepherd, the ultimatum, the deadline, and the two-way communication through the white-eyed ones, which that creature considers its weapon, but which he intends to turn into its grave. He called the plan simply, "The menu for the final feast," and he wrote it out on the board with chalk, just as he would write out the daily specials. Item 1. Reconnaissance through the flesh. Since the connection allows for two-way communication, a permanent outpost is needed at Grimholt, where Aaron will use samples of distortion to read the creature, its composition, its weaknesses, and its sleep cycle. Item 2. The army. 30 days to use courses of strengthening meals to train not 40 hunters, but 400 fighters from all the shelters and the fort. Item 3. Weapons. The cluster of 9 hearts remains in the cellar as our last trump card, because the creature wants it more than anything else, which means we can use the cluster to lead it like a bull by the ring. Voss listened, and his officers took notes without looking up. Then the major stood up and stated the very reason he'd come in person rather than sending a package. Fort Garnett is entering the war with all its might. 200 soldiers. All equipment running on whatever fuel remains. Harpoon crews from all depots. Because headquarters had done the math and concluded that a 5th-rank creature milking the edge like a herd spells the end for any fort. It's just a matter of time. Bram added 100 Southgate fighters and said, looking at Aaron, that the refuge's debt to the cook was enough to last through 3 wars. Hagen silently placed the keys to all the caravan's warehouses on the table. The next month flew by in a blur, and it was the most intense period of the Crossroads' existence. Week 1. A hidden outpost was set up at Grimholt's salt mine, and every other day, Aaron would ride there and hold his palms over samples of the white-eyed creature's tissue, which Caden had stolen from the sleeping pastor, for hours on end. Taste memory unraveled the creature thread by thread. Composition: 26 hearts. Nature: stone and bone. The bud on its snout is the organ where the hearts ripen before implantation. Week 2. The hearth's kitchen switched to a wartime schedule, and the Feast of Heroes resounded 3 times a day. 400 people ate the physical training regimen, and Garth, who had finally fully grown, finished his saved portion of crab meat from the old reserves, and Joy bent the blacksmith's anvil. Week 3. Aaron reached level 34, and the cellar released the second set of permanent dishes. In the closed hall, the second feast began with the hearts of the Wolf King, the giant stag, and Valen. 12 more people rose from their cots, among them Bram, whose bowl had been waiting for its owner, and Voss, who said that a commander had no right to send people where he himself was not prepared to go. By the end of the 3rd week, the creature's readings revealed the key: a cycle. The shepherd could not keep the bud open for more than 3 hours at a time. The hearts inside the bud demanded rest, and once a day the creature folded its plates shut and went truly blind, relying only on the white-eyed ones along the edge. 3 hours of vision, 21 hours of protection. It could only be struck while the bud was open, which meant the creature had to be forced to open right there and then, wherever the cook decided. Aaron prepared bait that made Mira turn pale when she found out. The shepherd sensed the cluster and sensed the cook's heart, and would come only for both of them at once. So Aaron had to stand at the battle site campsite with the cluster in his hands, out in the open, alone. The tension was worse than before the Feast of the Nine. Mira screamed. Caden was silent, which was worse than a scream. The spot was chosen a week ahead of schedule, and once again, Hagen made the choice. A salt lake due south of the mountains, a dried-up basin, 10 kilometers of white crust where the salt dulls the senses, and not a single bush grows. A creature without eyes and with a dulled sense of smell will follow the only remaining channel, in communication with the pack, along a thread that Aaron would hold in his hands like a leash, and along the shores of the basin, in the salt ridges, the entire army of the region would lie in wait. On the 28th day, something happened that no one had expected. The white-eyed ones emerged at the gates of Ochag, all 30 from Grimholt, on foot across the wasteland. They stood in rows by the moat and spoke with one voice, and for the first time, that voice was not steady. The shepherd said he sensed preparations and steel, and that it was too late to change the terms. But he was making a final offer because tribute is more valuable than revenge. Let the cook give up only the cluster. He could keep his heart. The mountain would take 9 and leave. The council heard weakness in this. Aaron heard fear in it and understood, through taste memory, where that fear came from. For a month, as he read the creature, he left traces behind like fingerprints on dough. The shepherd sensed that he was being read. He no longer knew what the cook knew about him, and bargained blindly for the first time in his long life. Aaron stepped out to the moat and replied briefly to the white-eyed one. The tribute will be delivered to the Salt Lake on the last day of the deadline. All of it. 30 heads nodded in unison, and the column set off into the wasteland. And that night, Aaron went down to the cellar alone, and did something he hadn't even told Mira about. He opened the chest and separated a single heart from the cluster. Small, dark, and shriveled. The devourer's own heart, pierced by an arrow. Dead to all skills except one. His taste memory revealed in it the last spark of a child's connection to its parent, and the recipe that the interface highlighted above this heart, Aaron read with a chill running down his spine. Essence of kinship. When introduced into the body of a target sharing the same bloodline, it opens all of the target's communication channels to their fullest extent. Warning: the effect is irreversible. The final day of the deadline began with fog, and Aaron counted the fog among his allies. The troops had advanced to the Salt Lake 2 nights earlier and dug themselves into trenches along the basin's shores, so that by dawn on the final day, the 10 kilometers of white crust looked as lifeless as ever. 400 men lay beneath the salt and tarpaulins. Voss's harpoon crews were stationed at 6 points along the arc. Caden's trios were on the flanks. Bram's reserve was near the southern shore by the vehicles, and 2 field kitchen cauldrons were set up in the salt ridges on the leeward side, where, beneath their lids, the essences were simmering for the final hour. Aaron stepped out onto the crust at noon, alone, on foot, carrying a chest with a cluster in his hands and a field kettle on his back, and nothing else. He walked toward the center of the basin for an hour, and with every step, 400 pairs of eyes watched him from beneath the salt. Mira, lying on the northern embankment, later said that this hour had cost her 10 years. In the center of the basin, he set the chest down on the salt. He opened the lid, and 8 hearts glowed beneath the white sky, each in its own color. The 9th lay against his chest beneath his shirt, distilled into an essence and sealed in a glass vessel the size of a flask. We had to wait until just before sunset. The creature came from the north, and its arrival made the earth tremble. First, a hump rose above the far edge of the basin. Then the hump became a creature, and the creature was worse than any of the boys' stories. A walking mountain, 6 paws as thick as towers, a body of bone plates over gray hide, and where its muzzle should have been, a closed bud of plates, each from the gates of the hearth. The shepherd walked across the basin toward the light of the cluster, and the salt cracked beneath him like ice. Behind him came the white-eyed ones, 30 of Grimholt's men in single file, one behind the other, and Aaron clenched his teeth because he understood why the creature had brought them here. A living shield and eyes in case of salt. The shepherd stopped 100 paces away. The bud turned toward the chest and the man beside it, and a sound like millstones ground out from beneath the plates. Then 30 mouths behind him said in unison that the cook had proved wiser than his scent. Let him step back 1,000 paces from the tribute, and he shall live. Aaron replied loudly, so that the salt and everything beneath it could hear. He said that the tribute had been collected in full, as promised, 9 hearts, and he pulled from his bosom a glass vessel in which a small, dark heart hung suspended in an amber essence. He said this was the last one, his son's heart, and that he would hand it over only in an open bud, from hand to hand, because such was the price, and let the mountain itself decide what it feared more. Silence hung in the air for a long minute. Arena's taste memory trembled on the brink and revealed exactly what he had staked everything on. The creature's hunger and greed for the hearts of its own blood were older than its mind. The shepherd could not turn away from his son's heart. The bud's petals quivered and opened. From within, something gazed at Arena, something he had only ever seen through another's flesh. A damp bone bowl, and hanging in clusters from its veins were 26 hearts, glowing, and by their light, one could see how, deep within behind them, the creature's enormous native heart beat, the color of old blood. From the bud, a bundle of fused veins reached out toward the man, opening at the end into fingers. Aaron placed the vessel in his bony fingers, and when the bundle retreated, drawing the gift back into the bud, he exhaled a word into which he had packed a month of preparation. The word was feast. After that, events unfolded so rapidly that they could only be untangled later in retellings. The bundle carried the vessel into the bud, and the glass, as intended, burst from the pressure, and the essence of kinship settled upon 26 hearts at once. The creature's channels of communication opened wide, completely and forever. In a single heartbeat, the shepherd became transparent to one who could read the flesh, and Aaron, standing 100 paces away, saw him entirely from the inside, as if in a blueprint, and following the blueprint, he struck the edge. Salt rose like a wall. 6 harpoon cannons struck the open bud from 6 points along the arc, and 4 harpoons pierced between the plates into the living bowl. The chains tightened against the machines dug into the bottom of Voss's machine, and the machines roared as they strained apart. The creature roared so loudly that the tarps on the nearby gunnels burst, and it lunged to close the bud, but the plates, held apart by the chains, could not come together. The trios advanced from the flanks according to plan. The wide-eyed ones were knocked off their feet, tied up, and dragged away, because Arena's order regarding prisoners was the first priority of the entire battle. The creature lashed out with its paws, and each blow left pits in the salt near the house. The first casualties fell as early as the second minute, but the blueprint was burning before Arena's eyes, and he shouted into the horn, giving one command after another. The third heart on the left supplies the front right paw. A harpoon there, and the paw went limp. The 7th heart holds the spinal plates. A volley there, and the plates bristled like those of a plucked bird. He was dissecting the creature by its ligaments just as he would have dissected a carcass on a table, only the carcass was a mountain, and the knives were 400 men. By sunset, the shepherd stood on 3 legs within a ring of chains, and its bud was split open and shattered by a third. It seemed all that remained was to finish it off. And then the creature showed why it had lived longer than anyone else in this world. It stopped protecting the hearts. It began to eat them. The tendrils inside the bud tore away its own clusters and dragged the hearts down its throat, deep toward its own heart. And with every heart swallowed, the creature changed before our eyes. The wounds closed. The withered limb rose. The body became smaller, denser, and faster. The shepherd burned his collection for power here and now, and Arena's taste memory screamed a new line. Attention! The target is entering its terminal form. Upon consuming all the hearts, it will reach the 6th rank for a duration of 1 hour. Estimated time until completion, 7 minutes. Not even the entire army of the realm could stand against the 6th rank, and an hour would be enough for it to deal with everyone. Arene watched the mountain devouring itself, and the diagram of its insides, where 11 glowing points remained, and the path to its native heart opened up as the creature ate away at its own defenses. He grabbed the horn and bellowed the order that, in the plans, bore the name everyone feared: the final course change. The final course change was the contingency plan in case the creature proved stronger than all calculations, and Irene had outlined its essence to the council a month ago in a single phrase: if the mountain cannot be cut open from the outside, then the cook will go inside. At the sound of the horn, 2 teams by the cauldrons ripped off the lids, and 8 reserve men ran toward the center of the basin, carrying a steaming vat on poles. Inside the vat was the essence that Aaron had been brewing for 3 weeks from everything the land had yielded. The chill drawn from crab hearts and the heat of the ash-maned ones, along with the speed of a wolf and the solidity of Valen, all fused into one by the seasoning of the soul. The interface called this dish the hero's hour. The effect multiplied the body's strength tenfold for 60 minutes, and the warning label beneath the recipe was longer than the description of the effect itself. Once the effect wore off, the body would be completely exhausted for 3 days. Repeated use within a year is fatal. 6 of them drank from the ladle on the run: Aaron, Caden, Mira, Garth, Bram, and Voss, who drained his own ladle, saying that staff members were people too. For the 6 of them, the world slowed down and thickened. The salt beneath their feet became soft as snow. The battle cries stretched out into a low rumble. The creature was devouring their hearts, and on the map of taste memory, 7 dots remained, then 6, then 5. The 6 ran toward the mountain across the battlefield, their bodies burning with an alien force like torches. The entry plan hinged on 3 things: the chains that prevented the bud from closing, on the diagram that Aaron was the only one to see, and on the fact that the tendrils inside the bud were busy devouring, and the creature lacked enough limbs to defend the chalice. Garth was the first to enter the open bud, because someone had to take the first tendril head on, and he did. He took it, held it, and shouted for the others to follow. Behind him, Caden and the sisters fired a volley from the side at the plates, providing cover. Then Mira, Bram, and Voss charged in a wedge formation. Aaron entered last, and the world inside the bud was damp and hot, glowing with dying hearts like a cellar lit by candles. From the inside, the creature turned out to be a forest, veins as thick as ropes, a vault of bony ribs, and deep within, behind the last 3 hearts, beat the shepherd's own heart, the size of a wagon, and with every heart it devoured, it blazed darker and more fiercely. The beasts dropped their food and charged the people. What followed was a battle that no one outside witnessed, and which was later recounted by 6 people, their accounts matching in the essentials. The hero's hour against the terminal form yielded not superiority, but equality, and that equality held firm on the blueprint. Aren saw which nerve was feeding which strand and shouted, and the blades moved at his command. Caden, with a serpent's instinct, sliced through the darkness as if in daylight. Mira was faster than the strands. Bram and Voss severed the nerve cords with the coordination of men who had commanded formations their entire lives. Garth stood like a plug in the bud's throat, blocking the creature's outer tentacles from entering as they tried to scrape the people out of its own head. The creature devoured the last protective heart when there were 20 steps of forest left to reach home. The interface displayed a message: target has reached rank 6, duration 60 minutes, and the forest came alive all at once. Veins lashed out from all sides. The bone of the vault contracted in waves. The creature was no longer protecting its insides. It had decided to crush its insides along with the intruders and grow new ones, because the 6th rank was capable of such a thing. The vault was lowering. Garth, trapped in the throat, was crushed along with the shield, and in this crush, Aren made his final move, one that didn't fit into any plan, and it was born right there from everything he was. He was a cook, and cooks don't necessarily have to cut up what they can cook. He snatched from his belt the last vessel he'd been carrying from the quarry itself, just in case. The remnant of the essence of the 2 elements, that very first one, fire and ice, which the creature already knew and hated with every fiber of its being. But he didn't pour it into its heart. He smashed the vessel against the nearest main vein, through which, according to the blueprint, nourishment flowed from the throat to its own heart. The essence entered the bloodstream from within. The 6th rank served as armor on the outside. From the inside, it was the fastest bloodstream in the world, and the blood flow spread the war of fire and ice throughout the entire body in 10 beats. The creature screamed with every fiber of its being being all at once. The living forest convulsed in a spasm. The vault stopped descending because the body was too preoccupied to be crushed. And in the native heart, the size of a cart, a crack opened between the bone fastenings in the spasm. Aaron bellowed a single word: peace. It traveled 20 paces through the thrashing forest in 2 breaths. She stood beneath the heart, and she drove into the crack not an arrow, because the arrows had run out an hour ago, but her own blade, up to the hilt, with both hands, with the speed of a wolf fused into her being and everything she had accumulated during this war. The shepherd's own heart stopped, not like the devourer's, with a gradual fading, instantly, like a clock stopping, and the 6th rank died 5 minutes before the end of his hour. Then came the race outward through the dying forest, and Garth held the throat until the last one had emerged, and he himself stepped out just as the plates were already closing together and sealed shut behind him forever. The mountain settled, it lay down, and it did not move again. Outside, night had fallen, and the border army gazed at the dead mountain in silence, because no cries had been prepared for such a sight. And then the white-eyed ones screamed. Grimholt's 30 bound men screamed in unison, and the veil fell from their eyes like ice from a window. They saw the sky for the first time in years, and wept, and that was the first sound of victory. The hero's hour ended for the 6 of them right there, and they lay down on the salt, drained of strength, and were carried to the cauldrons in the arms of others. Lying on a stretcher, Aaron gazed at the stars and listened as the interface spewed out lines of text. Experience for a 5th rank creature in terminal form. Level 40. Attention! The limit of known profession thresholds has been reached. The path beyond is not described by the system. The path remains to be created. He let out a weak laugh, and Mira, from the stretcher next to him, asked what was so funny. He replied that, for the first time, the system had admitted it didn't know the recipe. Aaron spent 3 days of exhaustion on a stretcher by the cauldrons, and for those 3 days, the Edge operated without him, and that in itself was an achievement. The guild functioned like a living organism. Dorn set up a field camp by the lake. The sisters posted guards around the carcass, because the scent of a dead 5th rank creature was already drawing all sorts of creatures toward the basin. Hagen organized supply convoys from the crossroads. Voss maintained military discipline, while Bram kept order among the people. The army counted its casualties and buried them with honors. The toll was heavy, but not catastrophic. 29 dead out of 400 against a 5th rank beast. Voss said that in the old world's textbooks, for such a ratio, medals were stripped from veterans of past wars and awarded to new ones. On the 4th morning, Aaron got up and went to the carcass, and the work that began at the Dead Mountain later entered the region's songs as the Great Butchering. The sequence of events over those weeks unfolded of its own accord. On the first day, Aaron, with practiced ease, led 40 butchers from all the shelters across the carcass, marking out the layers with chalk on the bone slabs just as one marks out mine tunnels. By the end of the first week, convoys carrying 5th rank meat were heading from the mountain to the cellars of the hearth, and the taste memory was cataloging every layer. By the 3rd week, 26 empty heart chambers were extracted from the bone bud, and, most importantly, the intact system of veins in which the shepherd had been ripening hearts, and Aaron spent the night poring over this discovery. The interface responded with a line of text, prompting him to summon the council directly to the carcass. A unique ingredient has been discovered, the Garden of Hearts. When properly processed, it is suitable for cultivating heart crops from samples without killing the hosts. The meaning of the message reached the people one by one, and it was clear from their expressions who had grasped it. Hagen sat down on the bone. Meat with these properties no longer required war against monsters on the same scale as before. Properties could be cultivated. Caden was the first to find the words, and they were true to his spirit. He said that the cook had just transformed the hunt from a war into a craft, and that the old world fed on fields, while the new would feed on gardens of hearts. And may his wolfish soul forgive him, but this is right. The return to the hearth was a triumph the crossroads had never seen seen and would never see. The road from the lake to the gates was lined with people. From Southgate, Milford, and Fort, people had come to watch the wagons carrying the mountain's carcass, and on stretchers they carried the 6 who had been inside. People touched the sides of the wagons as one might touch the gates of a temple. And at the gates themselves, a delegation awaited Arena, one that left him at a loss for the first time since the war began. 30 former white-eyed Grimholts, led by their elder. The elder bowed and said they had one request for the guild leader. Grimholt wishes to swear allegiance to the hearth on behalf of the entire settlement and asks to be accepted there, where they were brought back to life. He added quietly that for years they had seen the world through the eyes of beasts, and now wished to live out their remaining years through human eyes by a warm hearth. The region had not experienced a winter like this since the day the obelisks fell. A fire burned in the hearth's great hall, and the line was not for survival, but for supper. The Feast of the Nine had reached its 3rd round, and permanent membership was granted to the best of the guild's trios, selected not by Aren alone, but by the council. The Garden of Hearts had taken root on the lower level of the cellar, and the first crop of wolfheart yielded a broth indistinguishable from the wild variety. Hagen wept openly over his cup. The kitchen was teaching. A school had opened next to the restaurant, where Aren was imparting his skills to the young students. Cooking classes for those whom the obelisks had granted the region over the past half year, 3 more, and who had previously been ridiculed in their own hideouts. He looked at these boys and girls standing by the cauldrons, and saw himself from half a year ago, with a ladle in hand and white fingers. And in the middle of winter, what Aren had been waiting for, and feared more than any new creature, arrived. Politics arrived. First, in a letter from the fort, where headquarters inquired with the utmost politeness about the guild's plans for the Garden of Hearts, and proposed joint management of this strategic resource. Then, via a messenger from the east, beyond the enclaves and across the wasteland, a region the region knew only through rumors. The messenger brought gifts and a charter in which the alliance of the eastern enclaves recognized the hearth as a sovereign power and proposed a treaty on trade in heart crops and on borders. Aren reread the word borders 3 times. The council convened for a difficult and lengthy session. Voss spoke plainly, saying that the garden made the hearth richer than any fort, and that wealth without power is devoured, while with power it is feared, and envy had already spread far and wide. Bram said that the realm had withstood the mountain, but against human greed, different kinds of walls were needed. Hagen spoke of prices, and of how a monopoly on a miracle was an invitation to war, and proposed selling the crops equally to everyone, so that no one would have a reason to take them by force. They argued until nightfall. That night, Aren walked away from the argument to the watchtower, and that's where Mira found him. They stood there, watching the lights at the crossroads, and the roads where caravans traveled even at night. She asked why he was silent. He answered honestly. He'd started with a pot of food for 300 hungry people, and that pot had grown into a kingdom. Now the kingdom demanded that the cook become its ruler, but he wasn't sure that was his calling. Mira was silent for a moment, then said something he would remember for the rest of his life. She said that he had already decided everything back then, at the obelisk. His calling was neither that of a soldier nor a ruler. His calling was to feed people. This means his realm must be built not around a throne, but around a table. And there is room for everyone at the table, and no one wages war at the table. The next morning, Aren presented his decision to the council, and it was a cook's decision. The hearth would not be a realm with borders. The hearth would be the table of the land. The Garden of Hearts is hereby declared a common heritage under the administration of the Council of All Settlements. Crops are sold to all parties at a single price, and to anyone who sits down at the table in good faith. And the table's defense will be what already exists, the guild, the army that proved itself at the Salt Lake, and the glory of the mountain that fell because the land sat down at a single table. The charter from the east was signed with a single amendment. The word border was crossed out and replaced with the word road. And just as the messenger bearing the letter disappeared down the eastern highway, a young sentry galloped up from the northern outpost, and from the threshold blurted out the news that silenced the hall. From the dead mountains, The sentry had seen a light. Deep within the mountain passes, where, according to all maps, no one lived, a steady orange fire had burned for 3 nights in a row. Not a fire, not a thunderstorm. It was a fire that someone had lit and kept burning. Aaron set out for the fire in the mountains on his own, and no one even tried to argue with him anymore, because everyone knew that the cook had to unravel this mystery with his own hands. The 5 of them set out, just as they had on their best reconnaissance missions. Aaron, Mira, Caden, Hagen, who said his trails ended only with him, and a young cook from the school named Pip, whom Aaron had taken along, saying it was time for someone to see how the work was done. The journey across the wasteland took 6 days, and was quieter than ever, because after the shepherd's death, the territorial markings had spread throughout the region, and the beasts gave way to the trail. At the mountain passes, they were met by cold and silence, and on the 3rd night, in a gorge behind an old mine, they saw a fire nearby. The campfire burned at the entrance to a cave, and a man sat by the fire. An old man, clad in furs, his face as dark as bark. He showed no surprise at the guest's arrival. He said he had been waiting for the one who had conquered the mountain, and knew that he would come to the fire. For the curiosity of the strong is always greater than their fear. They listened to his story until dawn. His name was Olm, and 40 years ago he had been Grimholt's ore expert, and the first person the young shepherd, who had descended at that time, had placed under the white membrane. But the implantation was incomplete, and Olm remained himself within a foreign will, living for 40 years in the creature's lair as a slave and a witness. He saw how the shepherd raised the gatherers. He saw where the creature itself had come from, and when the mountain's own heart stirred, the film faded, and Olm was left alone in the empty lair. He lit a fire because, over those 40 years, he had come to understand the most important thing about people. They are drawn to fire. Then he led them into the cave and showed them what had made the 6-day journey worthwhile. Deep within the lair, the walls were covered with drawings that the shepherd had scratched out with his claw over decades. A map of the world as the creature knew it. And on the map, beyond the dead mountains to the north, lay lands the borderlands had never heard of. Other mountains, other valleys, and the markings of other beings of higher rank, arranged just as neighbors are arranged in the memory of the old beast. 7 marks, 7 sleeping mountains in the world beyond the edge of the map. Caden stared at the wall for a long time, and said that this was the answer to those who thought the war had been the last. Aaron looked at the same wall, and saw something else, and he spoke it aloud. He did not see 7 wars. He saw that the shepherd had lived for centuries without waging war against his neighbors, because a well-fed beast does not encroach on others' lands, and that the realm now knows of them before they learn of the realm, and the realm has time. Not for 7 armies, enough for a single table long enough that someday even the mountains could be seated at it. Pip listened with his mouth agape, and Aaron caught himself realizing that he was no longer speaking as an advisor, but as a teacher, and that this was right. They called for Olma to join them, but the old man refused. He said that for 40 years he had watched the world from the darkness, and now he wanted to watch it from here, from the pass where both the realm and the beyond are visible. He would remain by the fire like a lighthouse, and would be the first to see if any of the 7 markers stirred. They left him provisions and a cauldron, and Aaron taught him 2 simple recipes. As he was leaving, he glanced back. A fire burned on the pass of the dead mountains, and a man sat by the fire, and it was the best outpost imaginable. They returned home via Grimholt and Southgate, and the road itself summed things up. In Grimholt, axes clanged as the former white-eyed people built new houses, and the village elder showed Aaron the first greenhouse. In Southgate, Bram met them at the gate and led them to dinner, not in the citadel but in the common hall, where 300 people were eating a hot meal, and no one was glancing at their neighbors' bowls. Aaron sat in the spot where, 6 months earlier, his first pot of thin soup had stood, and he remained silent. Bram did not disturb his silence. The hearth greeted them with lights shining from every window. Spring had come to the crossroads. The first vegetable gardens were turning green on the cleared land near the walls. The garden of hearts in the cellar had yielded its 3rd harvest, and carts laden with crops were heading out on all 4 roads at a single price. The school was graduating its first trio of young chefs bound for the shelters, and Pip was leaving for Milford with his own camping pot. His eyes were burning so brightly that Mira said she recognized that fire. And on the first day of summer, in the great hall of the hearth, the event for which this story was told took place. Aron hosted a feast. It wasn't a war council, nor did Pip start it, just a feast. His entire world sat at the pushed-together tables. Mira was right beside him, and between them, everything had long since been said without words. And this spring, it had been said with words as well. Caden, who had never eaten a single dish except what he'd hunted himself, sat at the head of the guild's hunters' table, the guild he once called the Bones. Garth, with both arms intact, and his fiancée from Grimholt, Dorn and his sisters, Bram and Voss at the same table, united in a common cause. Hagen, who considered this feast a loss but was beaming like a polished cauldron. Toby, who had grown so much over the past year that Mira gasped. And 300 people from the region at the long tables, and just as many outside the windows, gathered around the cauldrons in the square. Aaron stood up with a goblet, and the hall fell silent. He wasn't good at giving speeches, so he spoke as best he could. He said that half a year ago, the system had given him a class that the square had laughed at, and that the system was right and the square was wrong. Because the world didn't break when the obelisks fell. The world had always been breaking wherever people ate alone, staring into their own bowls. But the world is mended where there is a communal table. He said that sitting at this table today are refugees who had gone hungry, soldiers who trusted no one, and people who for years had seen the world through the eyes of strangers, and they are all one now because they ate from a single cauldron. And that somewhere beyond the dead mountains, 7 more misfortunes lie sleeping, and someday one of them will awaken. But it will awaken in a world where the hearth stands, where hunting has become a craft, and strength grows in the garden, where a beacon burns on the mountain pass, and where, in the face of any mountain, the land sits down at a single table, and no one has ever been able to lift it from that table. He raised his cup and spoke his final words. "To the table!" The hall rose to its feet, and 300 voices echoed, "To the table!" The clinking of bowls rolled out through the windows onto the square and onward along the 4 roads in all directions. And late at night, when the hall had emptied, Aaron, as always, was the last to make his rounds through the kitchen. He checked the hearth, the cellar, and the garden. He stood by the board where tomorrow's menu was written in chalk. The interface flashed in the corner of his vision with the day's final line. "The path is not defined by the system. The path is being created." Aaron smiled, erased yesterday's menu, and wrote a new one. Then he blew out the lamp. A warm night hung over the crossroads of 4 roads, and in the darkness, the most important hearth of the new world, the one that would never go out again, breathed steadily and deeply with its embers. Aaron spent 3 days of exhaustion on a stretcher by the cauldrons, and for those 3 days, the Edge operated without him, and that, in itself, was the outcome of the entire story. The guild lived like an organism that no longer had a single heart. Dorn set up a field camp by the lake, complete with kitchens and an infirmary. The sisters posted guards around the carcass, because the scent of a dead 5th-rank creature was already drawing all manner of wasteland beasts toward the basin, and for the first 2 nights, the guards worked without sleep. Hagen organized supply convoys back and forth from the crossroads, and the men from the trading post, whom he had mourned a month earlier, now stood in his memory behind every wagon that was sent out. Voss maintained military discipline, while Bram maintained order among the people. The army counted its losses and buried the dead with honors on the southern shore of the basin, where the salt itself held the stones of the burial mounds in place. The toll was heavy, but not catastrophic. 29 dead out of 400 men against a 5th-rank beast. Standing by the mounds, Voss said that in the old world's textbooks, for such a ratio, medals from old wars were stripped away and hung on new ones, and that these 29 had bought the entire region. The names of all 29 were carved onto a board, and Aaron later hung the board in the hearth hall above the hearth so that everyone who ate would see the price of their supper. On the 4th morning, Aaron got up on his own, and first thing, went not to the carcass, but to the mounds, where he stood alone for a long time. Then he went to the mountain, and the work that began that day went down in the region's songs as the Great Butchering. The sequence of those weeks fell into place on its own. On the first day, Aren, with practiced ease, led 40 butchers from all the shelters through the carcass, marking out the layers with chalk on the bone slabs, just as one marks out mine shafts, and the butchers looked at him as miners look at an ore expert. On the third day, the first slab came down from the ridge, and beneath it lay meat as dark as night, and taste memory painted it with properties that the interface had previously kept silent about. During the first week, convoys traveled from the mountain to the cellars of the hearth, and they had to hurriedly dig a third tier of cellars because 2 weren't enough. By the second week, a workers' settlement with a kitchen and bathhouses had sprung up by the bowl, and Hagen was already speculating aloud that the road from the crossroads to the lake was so well trodden that it would be a shame to let it go to waste. Week 3, and they reached the bud. From the bone bowl, they extracted 26 empty heart chambers, and most importantly, an intact system of veins in which the shepherd had been maturing the hearts for decades prior to implantation. Aren sat over this discovery all night with his palms resting on the damp bone, and in the morning, he summoned the council directly to the carcass without waiting for the others to return. The interface responded to the discovery with a line that he read aloud twice. A unique ingredient has been discovered, Garden of Hearts. When properly processed, it is suitable for growing heart cultures from samples without killing the hosts. The meaning of the line dawned on the people one by one, and it was clear from their faces who had grasped it. Hagen sat down on the bone and remained silent, something that happened to him less often than rain in the wasteland. Meat with special properties no longer required war against monsters on the same scale as before. A property could be harvested from a living beast as a scrap of flesh and cultivated in the garden until it became a full heart. Hunting out of necessity was becoming a choice. Caden was the first to find the words, and they were true to his spirit. He said that the cook had just transformed hunting from a war into a craft, and that the old world fed on fields, while the new would feed on gardens of hearts. And may his wolfish soul forgive him, but this was right. Then he paused and added more quietly that hunters would not disappear. It was just that now they would seek out the new, rather than going around in circles after the same thing. The return to the hearth was a triumph that the crossroads had never seen and would never see again, because such a thing happens only once. The road from the lake to the gates was lined with people all the way. People from Southgate, Milford, and Fort had come to watch the wagons carrying the mountain's carcass, and on stretchers they carried the 6 who had been inside. And people touched the sides of the ox carts, just as one might touch the gates of a temple. Toby ran alongside his sister's stretcher for half the journey until Mira threatened to get up and walk on her own. And right at the gates, a delegation was waiting for Arena, one that left him at a loss for the first time in the entire war. 30 former white-eyed Grimholt men, led by the Elder, stood in formation just as they had once stood in the square facing the mountain, only now their faces were turned toward the crossroads. The Elder bowed and said they had one request for the guild leader. Grimholt wishes to swear allegiance to the hearth on behalf of the entire settlement and asks to be accepted there where they were brought back to life. He added quietly that for years they had seen the world through the eyes of beasts, and now wished to live out their remaining years through human eyes by a warm hearth. Aaron accepted the oath in the square, and when the village elder rose from his knees, the cook did something no overlord of the old world had ever done. He bowed to the settlement in return and said that it was they who, for 30 years, had maintained the connection through which the land had read the mountain, and that without their eyes, there would have been no victory. The elders of Grimholt wept openly. The land had not lived through a winter like this since the day the obelisks fell. In the great hall of the hearth, a fire burned from morning till night, and the line at the door was not for survival, but for dinner. And the difference between these lines was the very difference between the old year and the new. The Feast of the Nine had completed its 3rd cycle, and permanent positions were granted to the best of the guild trios, according to lists compiled not by Aaron alone, but by the full council. And that, too, was the outcome. Authority over the region's most powerful recipe was no longer the authority of a single person. The Garden of Hearts had taken root on the lower level of the cellar. The entire 3rd level was set aside for it, and for a week, Aaron and 2 apprentices connected the garden's veins to the nutrient vats, according to a blueprint that the taste memory had extracted from a living system while it was still a carcass. The first crop of wolf's heart ripened in 20 days and yielded a broth indistinguishable from the wild variety, and Hagen wept openly over his cup, then blew his nose and asked about the cost price. The second crop was crab-flavored, and the third was ash-speckled, and by midwinter, the garden was maintaining 6 lines, and Aaron looked at the fruits glowing in the darkness on the tiers, and thought that the kid with the ladle from Southgate wouldn't have believed a single word he said. The kitchen began to teach. A school opened next to the restaurant, where Aaron gathered young people into cooking classes, students whom the obelisks had sent to the region in just 6 months, and whom, in their hideouts, were ridiculed just as he himself had been. The boy Pip from Milford was brought in on the sly because his own leader, like Crane had once done, had already declared the boy a resource. Voss traveled to Milford in person, and the resource arrived at the hearth with all his paperwork and a single small bundle of belongings. Aaron looked at these boys and girls standing by the training cauldrons and saw himself from half a year ago, his fingers white from gripping the ladle, and taught them, first and foremost, not recipes, but that a class is neither a death sentence nor a sack. Class is a question the world poses to a person, and the answer is written by the person themselves. And in the middle of winter, what Aaron had been waiting for, and feared more than any new creature, arrived. Politics arrived. First, in a letter from the fort, where headquarters inquired with the utmost politeness about the guild's plans for the Garden of Hearts, and proposed joint management of the strategic resource, and the word strategic appeared 4 times in the letter. Then came a messenger from the east, from the enclaves beyond the wasteland, places the region knew only through merchants' rumors. The messenger brought gifts and a charter in which the alliance of the eastern enclaves recognized the hearth as a sovereign power and proposed a treaty on trade in heart crops and on borders. Aaron reread the word borders 3 times, and each time he liked it less. A long and difficult council was convened, and for the first time in a year, the people at the table spoke not of a common enemy, but of how to divide the shared victory. Aaron listened and realized that this trial was more dangerous than the mountain because the mountain had a single heart, whereas here there were hundreds of them. Voss spoke plainly, saying that the garden made the hearth richer than any fort, and that wealth without power, but with power, people fear you, and envy had already spread far and wide, as his intelligence confirmed. Bram said that the realm had withstood the mountain, but against human greed, different walls were needed, and that he had seen in Southgate how quickly well-fed people forget hunger and begin to eye others' bowls. Hagen spoke of prices, and of how a monopoly on a miracle is an invitation to war, and he proposed selling crops equally to everyone, so that no one would have a reason to take by force what could be bought cheaply. They argued until nightfall, and parted ways without a decision. That night, Aaron fled the argument to the watchtower, where Mira found him. They stood there, gazing at the lights of the crossroads, and the roads where, even at night, caravans with lanterns traveled, their lights stretching in all 4 directions like sparks from a single bonfire. She asked why he was silent. He answered honestly, because he didn't know how to do otherwise. He'd started with a pot for 300 hungry people, and that pot had grown into a kingdom, and now the kingdom demanded that the cook become a ruler, but he wasn't sure that was his recipe. He knew how to read the flesh, cook up strength, and gather people around the fire. He doesn't know how to draw boundaries. Mira paused and said something he would remember for the rest of his life. She said that he had already decided everything back then at the obelisk. He was just afraid to believe himself. His calling is neither that of a soldier nor a ruler. His calling is to feed people. That means his realm must be built not around a throne, but around a table. And there's room for everyone at the table, and no one fights at the table because their hands and mouths are busy. Aaron laughed for the first time in a week and asked where a huntress had acquired such wisdom. She replied that it came from a wolf's heart. A wolf doesn't maintain borders. A wolf maintains a pack. The next morning, morning, Aren presented the decision to the council, and the decision was that of a cook from the first word to the last. The hearth will not be a realm with borders. The hearth would be the table of the land. The Garden of Hearts is declared a common heritage under the administration of a council of all settlements, where every refuge has one vote and the guild has two, because the guild feeds and protects. Crops are sold to all corners of the world at a single price, and to anyone who sits at the table in good faith, the price is set by the council, not the market, so that this miracle does not become a weapon of the rich against the poor. And the table's defense will be what already exists, and what is more precious than any walls: the guild, the army that proved itself at the Salt Lake, the glory of the mountain that fell because the land sat down at a single table, and the memory of 29 names above the hearth. The council voted while standing. The charter from the east was signed with a single amendment. The word border was crossed out and replaced with the word road. And the messenger from the eastern enclaves, after reading the amendment, gazed at Arena for a long time, and then said that he would carry home not a treaty, but news more important than a treaty. The news that beyond the wasteland live people who, after the end of the world, devised not a new fortress, but a new table. And when the messenger with the letter disappeared down the eastern road, a young sentry galloped in from the northern outpost, and from the threshold blurted out the news that silenced the hall mid-sentence. From the dead mountains, the sentry had seen a light. Deep within the mountain passes, where, according to all maps, no one lived and no one could live, a steady orange fire had been burning for 3 nights in a row. It was not a fire, because it neither grew nor died down. It was not a thunderstorm, because it remained stationary. It was a fire that someone was tending, stoking, and feeding with wood. Aren set out alone for the fire in the mountains, and no one even tried to argue with him anymore, because everyone knew that the cook had to unravel this thread with his own hands. Otherwise, it would haunt him for the rest of his life. The 5 of them set out, just as they had on their best reconnaissance missions. Aren, Mira, Caden, and Hagen, who said that his trails would only end with him, and that he'd seen the foothills as a boy and wanted to see them as an old man to even the score. As the 5th member, Aren took the young Pip, saying it was time for someone to see how the work was done rather than just hearing about it. The guild remained behind in Dorna with the sisters and Garth, and the farewell at the gates was brief because for the first time, the region was sending its people not to war, but on a reconnaissance mission, and the difference was palpable in everything. The journey across the wasteland took 6 days and was as peaceful as anyone living could remember. After the shepherd's death, the territorial mark spread like a wide wave across the entire region, and the beasts gave way to the trail 100 paces ahead. For the first 2 days, Pip kept turning his head, unable to believe that first-rank wolves would step off the road to make way for a wagon carrying cauldrons. Caden told him not to get used to it. The world makes way for those who have paid for it in advance, but the payment eventually runs out, and one must be ready to pay again. Aren listened, and thought that he could not find a better teacher for the school than this lone wolf, and that he would have to persuade him. At the mountain passes they were met by a cold and a silence of such depth as is not found in inhabited lands, and on the 3rd night in the mountains, in a gorge behind an old mine, they saw a fire nearby. A campfire burned at the entrance to a cave with an even, well-tended flame, and a man sat by the fire. He did not stand up as they approached. An old man clad in animal skins, his face dark and cracked like bark, his eyes showing neither fear nor surprise. He said he had been waiting for the one who had slain the mountain, and knew that he would come to the fire, because curiosity in the strong is always greater than fear, and the truly strong come themselves, and do not send others. Then he looked at the cauldron behind Aren, and added that a guest with a cauldron meant a long conversation, and he moved closer to the fire. They listened to his story until dawn, and no one interrupted him even once. His name was Olm, and 40 years ago he had been Grimholt's ore expert, the first person the young shepherd, who had come down from the heights back then, had wrapped in white cloth. But the implantation was incomplete, because Olm had been working in a salt mine that day, and the salt had weakened the particle. He remained himself within a foreign will. For 40 years he lived in the creature's lair, as both a slave and a witness. With his hands, the shepherd did work for which claws were unsuitable. Through his eyes, he kept watch over the nearby approaches, and Olm watched through his own eyes, as if through someone else's window, and he memorized everything because he had nothing else left to do. He saw how the shepherd raised gatherers from the captured young of various creatures, and how only one survived out of a dozen. He saw where the hearts went, and how the creature slept for decades, digesting its tribute. And he remembered where the creature had come from, because the shepherd thought in his presence without hiding, just as one does not hide from furniture. When the mountain's own heart stirred, the veil fell from Olm in an instant, and he was left alone in an empty lair, with a freedom he'd had nothing to spend for 40 years. And he lit a fire because, over those 40 years, he'd come to understand the most important thing about people. People are drawn to the fire. In the morning, he led them into the cave and showed them what had been worth the 6-day journey and the 40 years. Deep within the lair, the walls were covered with drawings that the shepherd had scratched out with his claw over decades, thinking that no one could see him. A map of the world as known to the creature that had lived for centuries. The region with the crossroads and shelters was a small corner at the bottom of this map, and beyond the dead mountains to the north and toward the sunset lay lands the region had never heard of, other mountain ranges, other valleys with threads of rivers, a vast inland sea that even Hagen, with his 40 years of travel, knew nothing about, and markers, 7 markers scattered across the distant lands, just as a neighbor places them in the memories of his neighbors. 7 beings of the highest rank, each sleeping in their own corner of the world. Near each marker, a shepherd had scratched out symbols, and Aaron's taste memory, pressed against the furrows, read fragments of meaning through residual distortion. Near one marker stood the concept elder, near another the concept hungry, near the third something that Aaron could only translate as one who also gathers. Caden stared at the wall for a long time and said that here was the answer to those who thought the war was the last. Hagen gazed at the inland sea, and his lips moved because he was already counting the roads. And Pip asked in a thin voice what everyone was thinking. "They'll come." Aaron looked at the same wall and saw something else, and he spoke of it aloud, choosing his words slowly because he was speaking not to his companions, but to the future. He saw not 7 wars. He saw that the shepherd had lived for centuries without waging war against his neighbors, because a well-fed beast does not encroach on others' territory, and that all 7 were sleeping as he had slept, because the peace among the highest-ranking beasts is sustained not by fighting, but by distance and satiety, and that the land now knows of them before they learn of the land, and this knowledge is more valuable than any army. The land has time. Not for 7 armies, because no one can gather 7 armies. For a single table, longs enough and bountiful enough that someday even mountains could be seated at it, because the mountain by the salt lake fell not because the land was stronger, it fell because the land stood united. Olma invited the entire group to come with him, one by one, and the old man refused them all, one by one. He said that for 40 years he had watched the world from the darkness of another's will, and now he wanted to finish watching it from here, from the pass, where on a clear day both the land and the beyond are visible. He will remain by the fire like a lighthouse. He will keep track of the winters and watch over the distant mountain ranges, and if any of the 7 markers should stir, the border will learn of it from him first. They left him 2 years' worth of supplies, a spare kettle, and warm clothing. And for 2 evenings Aaron taught him simple recipes using mountain lizards and snow moss, and the old man learned eagerly, as only those who have had nothing of their own for 40 years can learn. As he left, Aaron looked back from the saddle. A fire was burning at the Dead Mountains Pass, and a man sat by the fire, waving to them as they rode off, and this was the best outpost imaginable, because it was based not on orders, but on choice. They returned home along the long road through Grimholt and Southgate, and the road itself summed up the year, just as autumn does. In Grimholt, axes were clanging, and the once white-haired were building new houses along the old mining street, and the village elder showed Aaron the first greenhouse, where seedlings were turning green beneath the glass, and said that the people who had gazed at the mountain for years now couldn't get enough of the greenery. In Southgate, Bram met them at the gate. He had aged 5 years in a year, but his eyes had grown 10 years younger, and led them to dinner, not to the citadel, but to the common hall, where 300 people were eating a hot meal, and no one was glancing at their neighbors' bowls, and the children were sleeping against the walls, full. Aaron sat down in the spot where, half a year earlier, his first pot of thin soup made from the last of the grain had stood, and remained silent throughout dinner. And Bram did not disturb his silence, for old soldiers understand the value of such silence. As he left, Aaron gave Southgate a sapling from the Garden of Hearts, the first to leave the cellar of the hearth, and told Bram that the table of the realm must not remain in one place. The hearth greeted them with lights in every window, and Toby was the first to appear on the turret, along with the bell that had been cast over the winter from old world bronze. Spring arrived at the crossroads in full force, and with a sense of ownership. Near the walls, the first vegetable gardens were turning green on the cleared land. The Garden of Hearts yielded its third harvest, and caravans laden with crops set off in all 4 directions at a single price. The Eastern Trail, once a narrow path, had become a broad road lined with inns. The school graduated its first trio of young chefs from the shelters, and Pip was leaving for his hometown of Milford with his own first-level camping cauldron, his eyes burning that Mira said she recognized that fire because she'd seen it in a guy's eyes in Southgate over the carcass of his first wolf. Caden stayed on at the school as a fieldwork instructor and insisted he was doing it solely to keep the new cooks from getting fat, and no one argued because everyone saw how hard he worked with the students. And on the first day of summer, in the Great Hall of Ocha, the event took place that was the very reason this story had been told from the very beginning. Aaron organized a feast. It was neither a war council nor a feast to mark the beginning of the season, nor a reception for ambassadors. It was simply a feast for his own people, and over the course of a year, the entire region had become his own. Seated at the long tables was his world, assembled one person at a time, like a recipe assembled ingredient by ingredient. Mira sat at his right hand. Between them, everything had long been understood without words, but this spring it was spoken aloud as well, and the ring on her finger had been cast by a guild blacksmith from the tip of that very arrow that had pierced the devourer's heart. Caden presided over the hunter's table of the guild he once called a crutch. Garth, with both hands intact, and his fiancée from Grimholt, the first person in the village to stop fearing his height. Dorn and the sisters. Bram and Voss sat at the same table, united in a common purpose, and between them lay a map taken from the wall of the lair, which they had been studying for a week, not as soldiers, but as builders. Hagen, who considered this feast a pure loss but was beaming like a polished cauldron. Toby, who had grown so much over the past year that he now looked down on his sister. The mayor of Grimholt. An elderly sergeant, one of the 5 who had survived the Chimera's first attack. And 300 men from the region sat at long tables, with just as many outside the windows gathered around cauldrons in the square. And above them all, above the hearth, hung a board bearing 29 names. Aaron rose with a goblet, and the hall fell silent so that the crackling of the fire could be heard. He wasn't good at giving speeches, and in a year he still hadn't learned how. He spoke as best he could, simply, and in the silence each word fell into place like a knife into its sheath. He said that a little over half a year ago, the system had assigned him a class that the square had laughed at, and that the system had turned out to be right, while the square had not. Because the world didn't break when the obelisks fell. The world has always been breaking wherever people ate alone, each staring into their own bowl and guarding it with their elbow. And the world is mended where there is a shared table. He said that sitting at this table today are refugees who once starved, soldiers who trusted no one, a hunter who never took what wasn't his, people who for years saw the world through the eyes of strangers, and a merchant who trusted only the scales. And they are all one now, not because they signed a charter, but because they ate from the same pot and stood back to back in defense of it. He said that somewhere beyond the dead mountains, 7 more misfortunes lie sleeping, and he would not lie and say they would not awaken. Someday, one of them will awaken, but it will awaken in a world where the hearth stands, where hunting has become a craft, and strength grows in the garden and is sold at a single price to the hungry and the well-fed alike, where a beacon burns on the pass, beside which sits a man who chose the fire himself, where boys from the cook's class no longer stand by the obelisk amid the crowd's laughter, and where, against any mountain, the land sits down at a single table, and from behind such a table no one has ever raised it against him. He raised the cup above his head and spoke his final words. To the table. The hall rose as one, and 300 voices answered, "To the table!" And from the square, through the windows, another 300 voices rolled in, and the clinking of cups rolled out into the summer night and spread along the 4 roads in all directions, just as the scent of the first roasted wolf had once spread. The feast raged late into the night, and Aaron moved from table to table. At each one, a story of the year awaited him, and he listened to them all. Late at night, when the hall had emptied, and the last guests had dispersed to their homes and tents, he, as always, was the last to make his rounds through the kitchen. He checked the hearth and stoked the coals for the night. He went down to the cellar and stood in the warm darkness of the 3rd level, where the 6 lines of the garden glowed with a steady, living light. He went back up and stood by the board with the names, then by the board where tomorrow's menu was written in chalk. The interface flashed in the corner of his vision, the last line of the day, the same one that had been glowing there from the salt lake. The path is not described by the system. The path is created. Aaron smiled at the line as if it were an old friend. He wiped away yesterday's menu with his sleeve and wrote a new one for tomorrow in large, legible letters, because everyone would be reading it. Then he blew out the lamp. A warm summer night hung over the crossroads of 4 roads, and the air smelled of bread, the cooling iron of cauldrons, and young foliage from the vegetable gardens. Somewhere on the northern pass, in an unimaginable distance, the beacon of an old ore prospector burned. Somewhere along the dark roads, caravans carrying crops of the heart rolled east and west. And right in the heart of the region, in the darkness of the great hall, the very heart of the new world, breathed steadily and deeply through its coals, the one around which not a fortress, but a table had grown, the one kindled by a boy with the skill of a chef, at whom the square had laughed, the one that will never go out again, because a fire sustained by 600 hands cannot be extinguished.